America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world.
President Bush seeks to calm and console a shaken nation, vowing to avenge the deaths of thousands of Americans. And tonight, U.S. intelligence is linking Osama bin Laden to this worst terrorist attack in U.S. history. ABC and News 10 coverage continues now at 11. I'm Jennifer Smith.
And I'm Dale Shornack. Thanks for joining us tonight. The death toll could be several thousand and possibly much higher. The search and rescue obviously is going to go on for days now. The deadliest terrorist attack on American soil began just before 6 o'clock this morning our time with a sight that was almost unbelievable. A photographer working down on the street hands his camera to the sky and captures the beginning of a well-coordinated terrorist attack. A hijacked American Airlines jet slamming into the North Tower of New York's World Trade Center. 20 minutes later, most people still not sure what happened until this.
Oh my God! Oh, shit! Oh my God!
A second hijacked jet, a United Airlines flight, slammed into the South Tower, sending a blast of fire and debris shooting out of the other side.
As soon as it got hit, I was thrown to a window, so I was very lucky to get out. There's a lot of people that didn't get out. There's a lot of people coming down the stairs, burnt up. It's bad.
From another angle, you can see the United jet banking, slicing into the tower around the 60th floor. Debris raining down onto the streets below.
All the debris was hitting people that were running up south to north, and it was terrible. It was the worst thing I've ever seen in my life.
People running for their lives while firefighters move in to begin the rescue. The fire burning above them is weakening the steel beams in both towers. People hanging out of windows becoming desperate.
And then we saw the people jumping. We saw what we thought was debris, and we realized it was people jumping. I can't do anymore.
This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the two towers. A huge explosion now raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way.
The South Tower collapses. The 110-story building going down in a huge cloud of dust and smoke. And 40 minutes later, the terrible scene repeated again when the North Tower goes down as well.
The second building has just come down. The second, everyone's being asked to get down. Come down. The people are now panicking again. The second tower has just fallen.
All of a sudden I heard rumbling and we all started running away from it. The glass blew out and threw me onto the sidewalk.
It didn't end there. Hours later, a third building in the World Trade Center complex, 47 stories tall, also collapses in a cloud of dust.
I have absolute confidence that we'll figure out who did this and make an example of them so that this doesn't happen again.
Tonight, the rescue goes on. Heavy equipment is being brought in to move debris. Search and rescue teams are arriving from around the country to help look for victims and hopefully survivors. The two jets that crashed into the towers both hijacked from Boston. Both of the 767s were loaded with fuel for the cross-country flight to Los Angeles. Together, more than 150 passengers and crew were on board those jets. Investigators tonight are trying to figure out how two separate jets were hijacked at Boston's Logan Airport just minutes apart.
The Twin Towers not the only target of this morning's massive attack. Another hijacked aircraft then crashed into the Pentagon in what appears to be an extremely well-coordinated terrorist assault. USA Today's Mike Walters was one of the first reporters on the scene at the Pentagon.
This is the aftermath. This is what America watched. But it's the vivid images of the crash itself that will haunt me forever. As a journalist, we cover stories every day, reporting on most events after they happen. But on this day, instead of reporting on the story, I had become part of it.
Traffic was backed up, came to a standstill. I was sitting in the car listening to the radio accounts of what had happened in New York, and the president had just made a statement. And I looked over to the side, and I saw this jet coming in, and it was really low. And it was an American Airlines jet. You could read the AA on the side, silver fuselage, and it kind of disappeared over this embankment here for a moment, and then huge explosion, flames flying into the air and just chaos on the road.
While I was outside watching on the highway, Rear Admiral Craig Quigley was inside the Pentagon.
Many in the building felt a thud and heard kind of a muffled explosion.
Clearly, it was a loud explosion, significant concussion blast. I can say that I'm thankful in the new wedge, in the new construction, they replaced the windows with blast-resistant windows. In my office, the windows shook but did not break.
Thankful for the windows, thankful to be alive. There were so many lives lost. The intense fires kept rescue crews away for hours, making it difficult to determine just how many people were injured and killed. But this was an attack that had shaken us all.
Clearly, this is something that every person who was a part of this tragedy will carry with them for the rest of their lives.
Mike Walter, USA Today.
The fire at the Pentagon burned into the night. ABC News reporting there may be more than 800 dead in the Pentagon alone.
Well, the fourth crash involved in today's attacks was United Airlines Flight 93, which was leaving from Newark, New Jersey, and headed to San Francisco. And we've learned that some of the passengers ultimately were bound for Sacramento. Flight 93 crashed in rural Pennsylvania, killing everyone on board. Tracking data shows that the plane took a hard turn south near Cleveland and then headed in the direction of Washington, D.C. ABC News has learned that shortly before changing directions, someone in the cockpit radioed in and asked the FAA for a new flight plan with a final destination of Washington. It's believed that Camp David, Maryland, the presidential retreat, was the intended target. Special passenger information hotlines are being set up tonight for those still searching for information regarding a loved one who might have been on board one of those flights. For United Airlines, the number is 800-932-8555. And for American Airlines, 800-245-0999.
The young man who helped me with my baggage up the stairs was telling me what happened, and I just started shaking. I thought, it can't be happening. It doesn't seem real. It still doesn't seem real, but obviously it is.
A young San Francisco man was on United Flight 93. He was one of several doomed passengers who were able to call out before their planes crashed. He called on the plane's airphone, telling of terrorists taking over the plane. He said 3 men told the passengers they had a bomb. 31-year-old Mark Bingham made the call to his family just after dawn. He told them he was on board the flight from Newark to San Francisco, and he wanted them to know he loved them.
He just said, I want to let you all know that I love you very, very much in case I don't see you again.
I said that?
That the plane has been taken over by hijackers. And then I said, well, we love you very much too, Mark. Let me go get your mother.
He said, I want you to know I love you very much, and I'm calling you from the plane. We've been taken over. There are 3 men that say they have a bomb. And I said, well, who are they, Mark? And he repeated that he loved me, and he said, I don't think he said, I don't know who they are. He became distracted there as if someone was speaking to him, and he said it's something to the effect of it's true, and then the phone went dead.
Mark Bingham was the only child of Alice Hoagland. She is a flight attendant with United Airlines. Bingham owned a public relations firm back east, and he had an office in San Francisco.
Well, the terrorists struck thousands of miles away from California, but as we've already learned, there's a strong California connection. One flight was bound for San Francisco. The other 3 were bound for Los Angeles. And as Steve Alvarez shows us, it's already hitting home.
His is the first face that Southern Californians have been able to put on this terrorist tragedy. 41-year-old Edmund Glazer, a longtime resident of Woodland Hills. He was on one of 2 flights out of Boston that slammed into the Twin Towers in New York this morning. Video of that attack slammed home the reality of the tragedy for his friends and co-workers.
It brought everything home. I mean, terrorist is always, you can think the terrorist is always around the corner, but until it hits you, you really don't believe it. And here it is, and we've seen it on television. I mean, that second plane that crashed, I think, was Edmund's plane.
Edmunds worked for MRV Communications in Chatsworth. The company's CEO and longtime friend, Noam Lothan, is dealing with the fact that he was the reason Glazer was on that plane.
I actually asked Edmund Glazer to travel to Los Angeles today. You know, he called me yesterday, said, if you need me, I'll come. And I said, yes, Edmund, I need you.
Today, employees needed each other to lean on in dealing with Edmund's death. He had moved with his wife and son to Boston 2 years ago, but was still close to many here in Southern California.
It's very hard to accept right now, so it's only in times when you're by yourself that you can really face what's going on.
Diana Hayden was with Edmunds and other company officials exactly 1 month ago today, when ironically, in New York, Edmunds rang the bell on Wall Street celebrating his company's growth. 1 month later, celebration has turned to sorrow, as this small company deals with the loss of a friend and the horror of his death playing out over and over again on television.
I really don't want to watch the clips anymore today because it's just very hard to watch them. So trying to avoid the TV for the most part today, at least, in terms of not seeing that.
Well, another known victim from the Los Angeles area is a producer for the popular sitcom Frasier. David Angel and his wife were on board one of the planes that crashed into the World Trade Center.
Everyone's got family, kids, wives. People going to work doing their thing and they get blown up. I mean, it's just shock. Just pure shock.
It is such a shock, and many people are trying to process the scope of today's tragedy. And this evening, many turn to their faith for comfort. This prayer service at Stockton's Cathedral of the Annunciation is just one of many across the valley tonight. Parishioners gathered to mourn those who lost their lives and the lives of the rescuers trying to save them.
It's a sad thing. I mean, how they died in the buildings and the explosions and so forth, and the people going to save them, and it's sad. And I'm coming here just to pray and hopefully that God takes care of them.
A priest told church members that Stockton Catholic Bishop Stephen Blair was in Washington, D.C. today, but he was not harmed. He sends a message of peace and not vengeance back home to the valley tonight. Hundreds of students and faculty members gathered at the University of the Pacific this afternoon to share their grief and information. The school's president said the attacks will change all of our lives. He set up this gathering to allow people on campus to talk about the tragedy. The session began with a group prayer with several religions represented. Students then shared their thoughts, some saying it's important to avoid blaming certain groups or countries until we know exactly who is responsible.
State and federal buildings all across the country were closed today. Employees who work at the California State Capitol were told about 8:30 this morning that they were free to go home. By midday, the state Senate and Assembly sessions had been canceled, and the Capitol was closed to all non-essential personnel. Most of them took the news with some relief.
Yes, I'm scared to death. I really am. I thought when I got in this morning there would have been more security.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I felt nervous sitting up in this building saying, shoot, this is kind of a high-profile target, you know. So, in a way, I'm glad it's canceled.
The State Assembly and the Senate are scheduled to go back to session tomorrow morning. The Capitol will reopen tomorrow as well, barring any developments between now and then. Governor Davis will return to the state capitol tomorrow after setting up a temporary office at the West Sacramento Highway Patrol Academy. That's where the governor helped coordinate emergency response efforts across California today and sent an important message.
I want to urge all Californians to be calm, if they can, to spend this day with their family, and above all else, to say a prayer for the many victims of this dastardly act committed in New York and Washington.
Most locations that were closed around the state today are expected to be open again tomorrow, but many will probably be open with increased security.
The country's airports, including Sacramento International, remain closed tonight. Commercial flights are grounded by the FAA until at least 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. News 10's Mark Hedlund reports it became a day of frustration mixed with sorrow.
All flights have been canceled out. All air travel's been halted.
The message clear and complete.
Worried about the Pentagon, maybe evacuated the White House.
The reason too awful to believe. And as those images sear into the mind, canceled flights almost a relief.
I don't want to fly. It's not good. It's pretty devastating. I can't imagine what's going on back there. But
Judy Reed and hundreds of others boarding, then told they aren't going anywhere.
When the captain comes on and says all of a sudden all planes are grounded, and you don't know what's happening, it's very frightening.
This plane load of passengers actually in the air from San Francisco to Denver. Sudden diversion into Sacramento. Told only it was a national emergency.
Everyone was absolutely stunned, dead silent. Nobody was talking.
And while the airport is being shut down,
we don't know what to do. Well, I can't let you into the airport grounds.
The freeway off-ramp becomes an airport checkpoint. Pick up a passenger or move on. I-5 backed up 2 miles, some still not knowing what happened.
Everything's shut down. See, they don't believe you.
Believe it. Unprecedented disaster brings unprecedented caution. Sweeping all terminals for explosives, deputies taking over. Thousands inconvenienced, but that is not their concern.
I just want to go home. I just want to go home and be in my safe house, call my family.
And the bustling business of air travel simply and completely stops. Mark Hedlund, News 10.
The earliest the FAA will allow flights to resume is 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, but one airport official thought that was too optimistic. SAC International averages 22,000 passengers every day.
Well, transatlantic flights were immediately diverted to Canada after airports across the U.S. were shut down earlier today. Several flights, including United and American Airlines flights, were directed to the Mirabel Airport just north of Montreal. One pilot said that the crews will spend at least one evening there before continuing on to their final destination once air traffic resumes again. With the uncertainty, Canadian police took no chances today. They stormed this United Airlines flight that was on its way from Tokyo to the U.S. before it was diverted to Canada. Everybody on board is safe, but security remains very tight, not only for at the Canadian border, but also our border with Mexico as well.
It's pretty devastating. See people would do things like that. Something's got to be done, and you just can't do anything about it. You're pretty helpless.
Well, at the direction of Governor Gray Davis, 3 California urban search and rescue teams have been deployed to the East Coast tonight. One of those teams from Sacramento.
It's a team that has been to Oklahoma City. They've been to the Northridge earthquakes, but as News 10's Dan Adams tells us, Sacramento's elite team may be facing its biggest assignment ever.
At the B.T. Collins Army Reserve Center, they arrived.
Lock your hood and trunk, please. Open up the glove compartment. Turn the car off.
Met by armed military guards on heightened alert, searching everyone, everything.
And he's already checked your ID, sir?
59 men, 3 women, 4 dogs, taking military aircraft, heading into what, by all accounts, is a war zone.
So it was a terrible tragedy. I feel so bad for the people and the friends and the loved ones of all those victims back there.
After checking in, they are bussed several blocks away to staging to prepare for what they will soon encounter, digging through rubble, hoping to free the living trapped.
I'm up to the challenge. I look forward to assisting in any way we can. We're all ready, we all prepare, we all train, we all are ready to do this, and you know, should the need arise, we'll get in and do what we can.
To get on the aircraft, you will need Nomex on.
They are prepared, they are trained, they have the equipment. But as a veteran of Oklahoma City questioned, how well can one really prepare for something like this?
You can't prepare mentally for something like this. It's just beyond comprehension. So.
We got to get out of here in 15 minutes, sir.
From the first call this morning until the time they left this afternoon, they had 6 hours to deploy. Quick goodbyes, barely enough.
It's difficult for me, but, you know, I mean, my husband's still alive, so I'm worried about him, and I'll just keep praying for him. But I feel for the families who've lost people.
By tomorrow, they will be in New York, expecting the worst, hoping for a miracle.
It's something that our team is ready for, and we're going to go do the best job we can.
Dan Adams, News 10.
And we all wish them well. Resources here in California are already stressed. Many firefighters already fighting the massive wildfires still burning across the state.
And because of that, extra firefighters are being brought in while the urban search and rescue team goes to work in New York. Well, donations are being accepted by many organizations. If you'd like to donate by credit card, you can call the Red Cross at area code 916-368-3123. The Salvation Army is accepting money donations at all of its locations. For more information on that and how you can help out, in Sacramento, you can call 916-563-3700 or 800-SAL-ARMY, which is 800-725-2769.
As the tragedy of today's attacks sinks in, people around the country are looking for ways to help, and one way is to give blood. Thousands of people turned out at SMF blood centers across the valley to donate today. Lines stretched way out the door all day long. Those who came to give say it's their chance to help those injured in the attacks.
It's very scary. And I feel like our lives will never be the same. You know, the country will never be the same. And it's hard. So I just wanted to contribute.
You know, people are really raw here. It's hurting that they're seeing family and friends who may have been injured in this terrible disaster.
The Blood Center says the biggest need is for type O blood, which is used in emergency situations like today's. And they encourage people of all types, though, to keep giving in the days to come, since burn injuries suffered today will need a lot of blood over a long period of time to heal. And those long lines for blood donations have been repeated all across Northern California all day long.
Especially in San Joaquin County, where folks seem to pretty much drop everything to heed the call for blood. News 10's Cornell Bernard is live tonight with that story for us. Cornell?
Dale, well, as Jennifer said, the call has been for type O blood to be sent to those who need it back east, and the response from here has been nothing short than amount
of disaster experience.
The Northridge earthquake, Oklahoma City, Atlanta, 1996 Olympic bombing. Our team went back there in Oklahoma City, was the first team back there on the site. And
parking place. Heading nose diving.
Everyone on board died, including 38 passengers and 7 crew members. This woman says she saw the jetliner go down.
On impact, you could feel the impact and the fireball and like the smoke ball. It was so fast within seconds of each other.
At nearby Johnstown Airport, air traffic controllers got word just before the jetliner went down. They were told to evacuate the air traffic control tower.
We could not visually see the tower or visually see the aircraft from the tower 15 miles out, which is quite unusual for an aircraft that size. So we did, several of us stayed to see what was going to happen, to see if, in fact, the aircraft was going to come in closer.
Governor Tom Ridge toured the crash scene today. He is calling this tragedy an act of cowardice.
There is no rational explanation because we don't resolve our differences in this country that way.
All right. Well, terrorism hitting America, the impact visible on the New York skyline. We saw the 2 World Trade Center towers, each 110 stories, simply collapsing. These dramatic pictures coming from the New York Post. Of course, we've been seeing these all over the television networks and in the newspapers. It is almost indescribable. The New York skyline forever changed because of this acts of terrorism. All right, well, it is visible in the New York skyline, but what about the economic impact on the world? These are the questions that will be asked in the coming days and weeks. Fox News' senior business correspondent Karen Gibbs joins us now live from Fox Central. And Karen, we're already getting reports of immediate impact on the airline industry.
Oh, yeah, Laurie, you're already starting to see it because, this was a lot of business and leisure travel. These 266 passengers are really caught blindsided pretty much, and that's going to put a chill on any type of business leisure travel going forward. In fact, the airline industry expects to see as much as a 50% drop-off in business and might put them in a cash crunch through the rest of this month. That, of course, is going to really affect not just the travel, but the tourism business and certainly the economy. A lot of people, economists that I'm talking to, are now saying that this one act of terrorism could plunge the whole world into a recession as everybody pulls back. We've already talked about crude oil being higher. It's up over $1.55 in London, over $31 per barrel. Gold is still holding on to a substantial number of gains. It's up $15 now at $287, but still we're seeing the rest of the world stock markets down. Japan's off almost 7%, Singapore down over 8%, and Hong Kong off 9.5%. Malaysia's market was closed. You talked about the Twin Towers being closed. Now Germany's DAX market opening is being called into question. Their biggest office there, and I hope I'm pronouncing it right, the Messerturm, has been evacuated as well. And the Financial Times, of the FTSE 100 index, due to open in less than an hour in London, that could be very, very rocky with no U.S. guidance whatsoever. But we do have word that Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill is en route from Japan's Tokyo airport. He arrived there yesterday after a 4-day trip in China. Now, there's no information on how, when, or where he is going to arrive in the United States, but he is prepared to be back in Washington and hopefully in touch with Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan, who also says he is prepared to add more liquidity to world markets to help smooth out any type of financial dislocations that could be seen. Laurie?
All right, senior financial correspondent Karen Gibbs, as always, thank you so much.
It is impossible to underestimate just how devastating a day it was after those 4 terrorist attacks.
That's right. 4 U.S. aircrafts literally used as weapons. The World Trade Center completely destroyed and severe damage inflicted on the Pentagon.
There was another one. We just saw another one. We just saw another one apparently go. Another plane just flew into the second tower. This has to be deliberate, folks.
We saw a shadow, it looked like a plane. Next thing we know, it was boom, and the floor started shaking.
We just saw the big explosion. Yeah, David, we are looking at the replay of what happened that you're describing. It happened just moments ago. It sure appears that the building simply collapsed.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America.
Everything came down. Couldn't see, couldn't breathe. It's terrible. I've never seen nothing like it.
I saw the building just coming down.
We have watched the tragedy of an outrageous act of barbaric terrorism.
Just saw a burst, a big burst. And then I saw people jumping out of the buildings.
This is indeed the most tragic hour in America's history. And yet I think it can be its finest hour.
Everybody took cover to run. We ran down the subway, but the dust followed us down there.
I used to work on the 105th floor of the World Trade Center. Are we going to go down there? I'm in shock. I know a lot of people are still up there. I mean, I don't know where they are. Of course.
Our thoughts and prayers are with those families and those injured and those who are the casualties of today's attack. We also remember those thousands of people who are rescue workers. We ask now that we all bow our heads in a moment of silence and remembrance. Thank you.
This is a Fox News alert. I'm Todd Connor. This news just coming to us over the AP wire. It's actually a story that's going to be appearing in the Boston Herald. It has to do with possible suspects in this case. Authorities in Massachusetts, it says, identified at least 5 Arab men as suspects in yesterday's attack. In Tuesday's attack, launched from Logan International Airport, seizing in the central parking garage at Logan a car filled with Arabic language flight training manuals, according to sources for the Boston Herald. 2 of the men whose passports were traced to the United Arab Emirates were brothers, one of whom was a trained pilot, a source told the Boston Herald. At least 2 other suspects flew to Logan yesterday from Portland, Maine, where authorities believe they had traveled after crossing over from Canada recently. The car was rented from National Rental Car. It was secured by the FBI, and authorities have prepared a search warrant for it. But once again, authorities searching Logan International Airport have apparently seized a car, according to sources telling this to the Boston Herald newspaper. This car filled with Arab language flight training manuals. One of those men apparently connected to that car, a trained pilot. We're going to have much more on this breaking story that we're just getting in here to Fox News Channel a little bit later in this hour. I'm Todd Connor. This is a Fox News Alert.
All right, thank you, Todd. Well, until today, the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995 was the worst act of terrorism on American soil. Not anymore.
The attack was carried out by Jap torpedo planes together with dive bombers.
We went to war after terror came to our shores on the wings of Japanese bombers.
Bomb hit caused the Arizona to blow up.
We were terrified when car bombs exploded at our embassy in Beirut, but we prayed it wouldn't happen again on our soil until it did. We were a country under siege when a bomb went off in the basement of the World Trade Center.
It sounded like a bomb, then it sounded like something was falling, but it felt like an earthquake.
One guy came running out on fire. He was smoking, he was on fire.
It was terror in the heartland when a truck loaded with fertilizer blew up at the federal building in Oklahoma City, and we were outraged when we found out the man who did it was an American. The bombing in Centennial Park rocked the Olympic Games as the world watched, and the simultaneous attacks on our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania brought fear that terrorism was coming close to America. Then the USS Cole, a Navy vessel, bombed while it stopped to refuel in Aden, Yemen. But nothing could prepare us for today. 4 planes hijacked, each with a target. 2 to the World Trade Center, the 2 biggest buildings in New York City. 1 to the Pentagon, the heart of our military. The 4th crashed near Pittsburgh. Reportedly, it was heading for Camp David, the presidential retreat, and perhaps ironically, the location where the Camp David Middle East Peace Accord was signed. There is no doubt that terror has come to our shores, and the big question is who? Who is so full of hate that they could cause such destruction? The Afghanistan government, the Taliban, accused in the past of providing sanctuary for terrorist Osama bin Laden, claims they and he are not responsible. David Asman, Fox News.
It is now 32 minutes after the hour. We're about 17 and a half hours since this nightmare began. I'm Rick Fulbaum.
And I'm Lori Dew. Thank you for joining us here on the Fox News Channel. Let's go over what happened on a day that really rivals any of the darkest days in our American history. First, a passenger jet crashes into the World Trade Center, and the race to put out the fire begins.
But then just minutes later, a second plane flies around to the adjacent tower and slams into it, and suddenly America is under attack, and the attack actually extends beyond New York City. The Pentagon, America's home for national security, is ripped by a third plane crash.
And then a permanent gaping hole in America's security and its skyline is made as Tower 1 of the World Trade Center crumbles to the ground.
Followed moments later by the second tower sinking into the ground, killing thousands, including those would-be heroes who had come in to rescue the people who were injured by those plane crashes. And just when it seemed like the worst was over, a fourth plane crashes in western Pennsylvania. We later find out that it could have possibly been headed for the White House. And then these haunting images from Jerusalem. Palestinians smiling, cheering, celebrating in the streets, rejoicing in the deaths of thousands and thousands of Americans.
A nation reverberating in shock. A nation stunned, looking to its leadership, and President Bush promises to punish anyone and everyone responsible and any country that may protect these terrorists. Congress rallying together. Partisanship a non-factor today, standing together on the Capitol steps, singing God Bless America, promising to cooperate and to bring those responsible to justice.
And now the rescue missions. New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani says that there are people alive underneath the rubble in Lower Manhattan, promising that the city will do whatever it can to get to them. And those search and rescue operations underway right now. Let's get the latest on those operations where the Twin Towers used to be with one of the first reporters who was able to report live from the scene, my colleague Rick Leventhal. Rick.
Rick, Lori, hard to believe it's some 17.5 hours since the planes hit the towers, 16.5 hours since the towers came crashing to the ground. There is still thick smoke in the air over the scene, still apparently some hot spots in there. Firefighters are continuing to put water on the remains, the rubble of the World Trade Center buildings and area buildings that were also in smoke and flames, trying to cool things down. And as you mentioned, in the meantime, there is a search and rescue underway. We're told as many as 2,000 people are searching or will be searching or have been searching through that area looking for possible survivors. We have heard reports that at least 2 people may have called relatives using cell phones, apparently from the basement of one of the 2 World Trade Center towers, covered with rubble, buried under the debris, but able to get cells out and call people and tell them that they were alive and okay. We have also heard that there may have been police officers trapped as well, and we also heard that one of those officers may in fact have been rescued from the rubble already. We're not sure if more people have been located, where that rescue effort stands at this point, but again, we have been told that as many as 2,000 people are searching for possible survivors. Want to give you our mass cam look at the scene. If you haven't seen it already, this is a shot from our camera above a pole, above our satellite truck, that shows you Church Street right in front of the World Trade Center complex. An eerie sight with those 2 large pieces of one of the towers sitting right in the middle of the street, and the broken remains of the building littered all around it. Emergency vehicles all over the place, as well as police, fire, and other rescue personnel, obviously trying to get the situation under control as best they can. As many as 300 firefighters still missing, many of them presumed dead. At least 30 police officers also missing, and many of them presumed dead. And thousands of office workers who were inside the World Trade Center also feared dead. Those bodies likely to be recovered, many of them starting first thing in the morning as the smoke clears and the sun comes up, and they're able to move the heavy equipment into the area to begin moving the rubble and getting to the people who are buried beneath it. We also have pictures we can show you that were just shot a short time ago, raw video shot from the West Side Highway towards the scene where these buildings collapsed. Again, another vantage point demonstrating how awful this collapse was. We've been talking to numerous firefighters and police officers, some of whom went into the buildings before they collapsed. I talked to a couple firefighters not long ago who were on the 21st floor, making sure that people got out of the building okay. These firefighters reporting that the evacuation, for the most part, was orderly. And in fact, I spoke to a guy early this morning, soon after the buildings were hit by the planes, who told me he climbed down 77 flights of stairs and told me at that time that things were relatively orderly in the building as people were evacuating. But there were many people who could not get out. People who were killed in the initial explosion, others who were trapped on burning floors with nowhere to go. And those are people who you've probably seen the horrible pictures leaping from the building, from high floors, giving up all hope of surviving and just leaping to their deaths. The area, again, here in Lower Manhattan, completely sealed off by police. They are not allowing any vehicles in except for the firefighters and emergency workers and construction workers on scene. Again, these fire trucks are continuing to circle the area. There's one right behind me now. The area of Lower Manhattan off limits to anyone who doesn't belong here. The police have said if you're caught here with no reason to be here, you will be arrested. They're urging everyone to stay out of the area so that they can do the work that they need to do to try and clean things up, look for survivors, and recover the victims' bodies. Rick, Lori, back to you.
Rick, how is it the fact that the lights are out in Lower Manhattan, how is that affecting the search and rescue operations?
Well, they did cut power to this area, power and gas, because of fears that there might be more fires or explosions. But that, I don't believe, is hampering rescue efforts, because they do have generators out here. They have their own big lights. In fact, we saw the National Guard pull in here not long ago with trailers of generators and large lights attached to them. You know, the vehicles, you can see this fire vehicle right here has lights on it. They've lit up the area over there near the scene of the building collapse, so they do have light with which to work. But they have turned off the power, as you mentioned, in this area to avoid fires and that sort of thing. So anyone who lives here is basically out of luck as far as that goes.
Rick Leventhal. Thank you, Rick.
All right, we want to take you now to St. Vincent's Hospital, the hospital that is closest to where the World Trade Center stood until this morning, where upwards of 350 victims have been taken. Derry Alexander is standing by with the latest. And Derry, despite this tragedy, you have been reporting that folks are in high spirits there.
Well, yeah, Lori, if there's at all a bright light to the situation, we can certainly say here at the hospital they are very well prepared. One of the things we were talking about earlier is the fact that this hospital, as you were saying, close to the Twin Towers, or what was the Twin Towers, straight shot up 6th Avenue, straight shot up north from that area, the Wall Street, the financial center. So they are ready. They've been ready. They went through this in '93. Obviously, this is a much greater magnitude, but they've had to deal with, you know, a huge tragedy like that before. Earlier today, I was told that there were as many as 100 beds laid out in front of the hospital, just waiting to take people. The mood has been very positive here. It's been one of determination. It's been very hopeful. They want people to come. They want to receive people, because that means that obviously, you know, we're thinking that there are people still alive. Unfortunately, I have to say at this moment, we are just in a waiting state, and so are a lot of the staff. You got to think that when buildings like that are coming down, we're talking stories and stories of, I mean, so much debris. So if in fact there are people still there, they are underneath so much debris. So it obviously will take quite a while to get them out, and we're hoping that's exactly why it's taking a while to see patients come up here. One thing I can tell you, I know David Lee Miller had a lot of information to offer, and one thing I believe he said earlier was he was talking about police officers.
Those responsible and to bring them to justice. Indeed, we are already hearing quite a bit of talk from
planes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you. Good night, and God bless America.
President Bush at about 8:30 this evening Eastern Time, his first formal address to the...
Where they once...
State University. He is also a former New York City police officer. Mr. Levin, thanks very much for talking to us. And, you know, I said, how could one person, but clearly we're not talking about one person here, are we?
No, we're talking about a coordinated and professional effort here that took a long time to plan, could be even more than a year. This was executed with dastardly efficiency, and it's one of those things that those of us who track terrorism had feared. A lot of times the terrorists in the past have tried to do things, and they were more like Keystone Cops. These individuals were people who were very well trained, and they trained for a multitude of different things. They would fall under a category of terrorists that we would call ideologically motivated terrorists, and they're probably the most dangerous of these ideologically motivated, and that is the theologically or religiously motivated, these zealots. And again, zealots don't belong to any one religion, but in this particular case, these people were committed to their cause and willing to die for it, in fact, wanted to achieve martyrdom against an entity like the United States, which is considered the great Satan. These are the hardest kinds of individuals to deter because they don't care about losing their lives. In fact, that's part of the plan.
So who are we talking about, Mr. Levin? Is there a short list? Of course, everyone is thinking about Osama bin Laden. Some people are actually saying Osama bin Laden, although no government officials on the record as of yet. But is there a short list that you could tell us about?
Sure. I think Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda is at the top of the list. Look, this is someone who comes from a family that is quite wealthy, a billionaire dynasty out of Saudi Arabia. It also resembles the types of attacks we've seen before that were attempted. Give you an example. About 10 years ago, there was a plot to blow up the arterial highways and bridges coming into New York from New Jersey. Also to blow up the Diamond District, the United Nations and the Empire State Building. It was thwarted. There was also a plot to blow up 9 airliners over the Pacific. There are very few entities out there that have the motive and opportunity and resources to carry it out. To be sure, there are people throughout the world who loathe and indeed have extreme hatred for the United States, but I'd say bin Laden's group has to be at the top of this list.
Mr. Levin, it's Lori Dew. Question for you. Hi there. Thanks for being with us. Osama bin Laden has been interviewed. He can be found when he wants to be found. So what is the United States going to have to do to try to locate this man, and even go so far as to hunt him down?
Well, he's a difficult guy to catch. First of all, he's being harbored by the Taliban, which, look, let me tell you something. This denial from the Taliban is rubbish.
Right.
The Taliban has harbored this known international fugitive for some time now, and I think the Taliban is not necessarily responsible for this, obviously, but they certainly know that they're harboring a known wanted terrorist. This guy travels in nomadic convoys probably throughout Afghanistan, and probably with a wink and a nod from the Taliban regime. He might also travel into rural parts of Pakistan, for all we know. American intelligence did track him. They almost killed him at one point a few years ago. They missed. They were tracking him through the use of a satellite telephone. But, you know, when you're talking about someone who is being harbored in an extremely remote part of the world by a government that is at least not against him, it makes it a more difficult operation. That being said, I think you're going to see a ratcheted response from the United States military to catch him, and, by the way, the people responsible for him. One thing that I just want to say, even if you take out Osama bin Laden, he has many minions out there who regard him as a mentor and who would carry out this work even if he was taken out. The thing here is he has the financial resources and the wherewithal to coordinate this kind of stuff.
Presumably the National Security Council and the intelligence community are meeting to talk about options to try to find bin Laden or whoever is responsible for this. We may not know who's responsible for quite some time. Should we have confidence in our National Security Council and in our FBI that they will find whoever's responsible for this?
Yes, I'm living proof that the FBI does their job. When I was working at a civil rights office in Alabama, they thwarted a bombing attempt. The thing is, in a pluralistic, democratic country like ours, we don't live in a hermetic...
President Bush addressed our very distraught nation earlier tonight with words of reassurance in this incredible time of trouble.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
In New York or Washington to see...
Inside the World Trade Center towers, I do tell you that most of them, it is almost certain, were able to escape, but some of them were not. And then there are the cars that were around. There are the people who were standing and staring upward in amazement as suddenly the buildings collapsed and the rubble came pouring down on them. What has happened to them? How many are there? These are questions we will not know today. I am almost certain we will not know tomorrow. It could be as long as a week. But as Mayor Rudy Giuliani has said, the areas that they have set up as morgues will likely not be large enough. This is the magnitude of the attack on New York City, on Washington, and on the United States. Dr. Robert Butterworth is a child psychologist. He has been with us through the evening here, and I hope that your children are in bed at this hour, but they will be up in the morning. They will be hearing the constant drumbeat of discussion about what has happened to the United States, and questions will be raised. So, Dr. Butterworth, we turn to you for some advice. What do you tell your children?
Well, Forrest, indeed, you're right. I mean...
I don't know how many they were able to evacuate or not, but 300 firefighters we know were in the process of doing just that, and they are feared dead, killed, also victims in this. Officials say it could be weeks before we know the final death toll. Crews are also on the scene at the Pentagon, where another hijacked jetliner slammed into that building yesterday. There has been no credible claim of responsibility for the attacks orchestrated here in New York or in Washington, D.C. at this point. Whoever was behind it managed to pull off an incredibly well-orchestrated and devastatingly effective act of terrorism. But officials say suspected terrorist mastermind Osama bin Laden is a prime suspect. We're going to go now to ABC's John Donvan for a look at how the entire day unfolded. Thanks.
Report in that there's been some sort of explosion.
The first thing any television camera saw this morning was this. It was just before 9. Roughly 15 minutes earlier, an American Airlines jet hijacked from Boston had crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. There were 92 people on board.
I was sort of at my desk working, general office activity, and felt an enormous it almost felt like an earthquake. Like I could literally feel and see things in the office moving and the floor moving. Immediately after it was some sort of explosion or something, there was an enormous volume of debris and paper. It almost looked like a dirty parade. All of this material just falling down.
It does not appear that there's any kind of an effort up there yet. Now remember, oh my God.
That looks like a second plane.
Minutes later, the second plane, the second tower. The fireball ate up the aircraft. It was a United Airlines jet from Boston, 65 people on board.
As soon as it got hit, I was thrown to a window. So I was very lucky to get out. There's a lot of people that didn't get out. There's a lot of people coming down the stairs, burnt up. It's bad.
Big explosion happened. Some guy came out. His skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
New York City was staggered, and still it wasn't over. Here in Washington, the Pentagon was now burning. Yet another hijacked aircraft, American Airlines Flight 77 with 64 on board, had crashed through the Pentagon's walls.
U.S. officials are saying there was no warning, no indicators of any kind of a likely terrorist attack. Number two, they say Pentagon officials within the intelligence and the counterterrorism offices are now looking at this very intensely.
Across Washington, ABC reporters were hearing officials use the word terrorism.
It seems obvious unofficially to people here that it was a terrorist attack, but they obviously can't reach any firm conclusions at this point. So the Pentagon is engaged, and I'm sure law enforcement is, but they say they had no warnings.
And around the nation's capital, a city full of potential targets, everyone was on edge.
Okay, there's been an explosion of some kind that shook the grounds of the Capitol. We all heard it. Everybody ran for cover. We don't know where it was. We don't see the smoke yet. Everybody's saying, get back. We're running, we're running, we're running, we're running. They're screaming at us to get back.
This was the president this morning.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. Two airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
Mr. Bush was in Florida visiting a school. At the White House itself, everyone was evacuated. Then the whole federal government was evacuated, every federal worker. And in Washington, it was instant gridlock. In New York City, meanwhile, they were also evacuating. And suddenly, the towers began to collapse in on themselves.
Why are they pulling us out of here?
Because of the late.
The North Tower is
Right, Marty, quick. Oh my God, there it goes!
I looked up as soon as we got across the street. I looked up, I saw the tower start to buckle. I just turned and ran, ducked down, put a jacket over my head. 3 or 4 of us huddled together, and it was just black everywhere.
And with everyone asking the obvious question, how in the world, answers will be coming in fragments.
The American Airlines Flight 11, the 767 from Boston to Los Angeles, a flight attendant called the American Airlines Operations Center to let them know that 2 flight attendants had been stabbed and the perpetrators had broken into the flight deck.
Then, just before lunchtime, in a green field in Pennsylvania, one final crash. A United Airlines 757 carrying 45 people from Newark to San Francisco. Reportedly, a passenger on board used his cell phone to call 911 before the plane went down. The president's safety had become an issue.
We flew for a couple of hours on Air Force One.
at what appeared to be a very high altitude. We were not told where we would land until the time came. There were jet fighters accompanying the president's aircraft. He has been traveling, we are told, by Ari Fleischer, and he will continue to travel.
Mr. Bush reached Washington earlier this evening. Already, we have these images that no one can ever forget. A tough guy mayor pained by what he saw.
The situation is that two airplanes have attacked, apparently. Can't go to sleep. Why? We should not go to sleep. All right, well then let's go north then.
The dust, everywhere the dust. And how it just wouldn't come off. And the desperate choice by desperate people who had no way out.
We saw what we thought was debris, and we realized it was people jumping. I can't do anymore.
Late this afternoon, another building weakened by the blast went down like a domino. This evening, an address to the nation.
These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation.
At this point, it's hard to believe that all of this happened in a morning. Military jets are crisscrossing the skies over Manhattan. National Guard units are out. Washington is shut down. Airports in the U.S. and Canada are closed. And the death toll is still uncountable and unimaginable. John Donvan, ABC News, Washington.
Unimaginable indeed. ABC's John Donvan perfectly capturing the shock I think so many of us are still feeling, still reeling at the attacks that were launched this morning. There is an unbelievability to the fact that we in the United States find ourselves in this position. We do want to recap for you. This is ABC's continuing coverage of the terrorist attacks on the United States. We have a live look now at the site of the World Trade Center where rescue crews are working around the clock trying to reach bodies of survivors. Many are feared buried beneath the rubble of the Trade Center's twin towers. Both towers collapsed after two hijacked jetliners slammed into them early yesterday morning. You can see there the eerie sight down in lower Manhattan, the rubble, the dust, the wreckage, and the unimaginable body count, as I'm sure. And here we have the very first pictures of the first jetliner slamming into that first tower. This is home video. Somebody down in lower Manhattan just happened to be rolling when that happened, when the very first part of this multi-pronged terrorist attack occurred. And it is a devastating sight, an unbelievable sight to see a jet of that size. All four jets hijacked this morning were 757s or 767s, massive jets starting out on the East Coast, flying for destinations on the West Coast. We were told, or there's been speculation here, in fact, ABC's John Miller thought that perhaps that was a deliberate selection by the terrorists because those jets would have been full of jet fuel, making them extremely incendiary, extremely inflammatory, and extremely devastating. And that was at least a successful selection on the terrorist part. It is a similar scene of devastation tonight at the Pentagon, where another hijacked plane was attacked and crashed into the Pentagon yesterday. Officials fear hundreds of people there may have died. They were there for work in the morning. One wall of the Pentagon's 5 walls apparently has collapsed. The military is reacting by putting all of its forces around the world on the very highest state of alert. And as we've been saying to you, there is also going to be mobilization. We've got aircraft carriers moving to positions off the coast of New York City and Washington, D.C., as well as Seattle, Washington. Standing by in case any other attacks will be launched, standing by, able to defend those cities and our country from whatever may happen. Despite the heavy damage at the Pentagon, it is scheduled to be open today, even as it burns and even as officials deal with what appears to be a large death toll there as well. ABC's Jim Sciutto is at the Pentagon. Jim, I understand there have been several not credible, incredible claims of responsibility, but there's been a new claim of responsibility that just came in a few moments ago that we're just learning about. Any credibility at all to this one?
Well, we've checked it out. Well, first let me tell you what it is. It's the Associated Press wires quoting foreign wire services saying that a Pakistan-based Islamic group fighting against Indian rule in the Kashmir, that, as you know, the disputed province between Pakistan and India, that this group called Lashkar-e-Taiba is claiming responsibility for the hijacking. But as you did mention, there have been many rumors. We've been in touch with the Joint Information Bureau of the Armed Forces as well as the Pentagon, both of them saying they know nothing of this.
And this is a Lashkar-e or Taiba, as you just said, a Pakistan-based Islamic militant group. Have they ever been responsible for any other forms of terrorism, or do we know what they might have accomplished in previous attempts?
No information beyond what I've said, and as I said, the Joint Information Bureau and the Pentagon saying they have no information about this.
And we should caution people as we say that they're, unfortunately, and after scenes of devastation like this, oftentimes terrorist groups are eager to claim responsibility for the terrible devastation, oftentimes many claiming responsibility when they had nothing, in fact, to do with the attack. Jim, the Pentagon is still burning at this hour?
It is still burning, still smoke coming out of the top, firefighters pouring water on the roof of the Pentagon. As I mentioned earlier, we saw flames breaking through about an hour ago. That's stopped now, but the fire chief here in Arlington, Virginia, where the Pentagon is located, saying they still don't have the fire under control and they want to get that fire under control before they continue the search and rescue and the recovery of victims as well. How
on earth is the Pentagon going to be open and operating given the fact that it's burning and given the fact that victims are still buried in the rubble there? Well,
it's still open and operating as we speak. On the other side of the building, offices, the Joint Military Command Center, where Donald Rumsfeld, the Defense Secretary, was in action earlier today, they're still in action. People working as we speak and planning to come to work in the morning, although they do plan to close off this section of the Pentagon. If you can imagine the spokes of the wheel emanating from the middle of it, they're going to shut off about a third of it between the 2nd and the 6th corridors. There are 10 corridors around like spokes of a wheel. They're going to shut off about a third of the building, but still the rest of it back to business in the morning. And Elizabeth, I just wanted to mention one thing. There have been many estimates of casualties so far here at the Pentagon and certainly in New York, but Pentagon officials convinced that something that I don't believe we've had a chance to report yet has made a difference. In the latest renovation of the Pentagon, all the windows were coated with Mylar, a very strong, transparent substance which is used to prevent the glass from shattering during explosions. During previous attacks on the U.S. embassies in Africa in 1998, as well as the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia in 1996, a lot of the deaths, perhaps even the majority of the deaths and injuries resulting from shattered glass. Tonight, Pentagon officials saying that the fact that the windows in the Pentagon were coated with Mylar, preventing that glass from shattering, may have made a very big difference. That is a nice bit of good news. And obviously, I didn't mean to interrupt you a moment ago, but the Pentagon having very important business being done there tonight. So it is an important place that, even despite the devastation right there, needs to be up and operating. To look at it from this side and see the smoke still coming out and the damage on this side of the building, to know that people are still at work in this building, really is quite incredible. All right, Jim, thank you so much for that report. We'll be checking back with you in just a few minutes. Public officials here in New York are obviously under an enormous amount of stress, as they have been since the disaster began. It has been especially difficult and deadly for New York's fire department. ABC's Chris Cuomo looks at their heroic efforts and the price so many of them paid.
An unprecedented terrorist attack. While thousands fled for safety, New York City firefighters were heading straight into the blast.
As soon as this happened, people were calling on the phone, every station in the city. How can I help? How can I help?
But with buildings of this size and fires of this magnitude, on this day, even their best wasn't enough.
We tried our best, and it was just too much. It was unbelievable. For me, it was.
When the towers showed signs of collapsing, they scrambled to escape. Most made it, but some couldn't get out fast enough. Exactly how many, we may not know for days.
Firehouse.
But what about the others? At this station, calls started pouring in.
Unfortunately, we don't really have much to tell them.
In all the chaos, there would be no quick answers, just firefighters looking for their lost brothers.
Get our brothers. Get our brothers. A couple brothers are also trapped down there.
It's a scene of frustration and fear. Trucks as far as the eye can see, blocked from going back, and a triage center already seeing too many firefighters.
Have you ever heard of an incident where so many firemen and so many policemen were hurt?
No, and I used to work at EMS many years ago, and no. I mean, firemen were coming in and telling us that there was 3 rescue companies that never made it out.
As of tonight, as many as 200 firefighters are feared to be dead. Many are missing, and still, the rescue effort has barely begun.
That is ABC's Chris Cuomo reporting on the New York City Fire Department. We have here, just to our desk, a report from the Boston Herald saying that authorities in Massachusetts have identified at least 5 Arab men as potential suspects in the terror attacks launched yesterday morning from Logan International Airport. They apparently have seized in the central parking garage a car laden with Arabic language flight training manuals. Of course, there's been a lot of speculation that whoever hijacked these airplanes needed to know how to fly them, being unable to convince any sane pilot to deliberately fly his commercial jet into a landmark, the Pentagon, the Trade Center towers. Also, there apparently, the sources in this Boston Herald report are saying that hijackers in one plane began to kill flight attendants on board the flight in order to lure the pilot out of the cockpit. At that point, they were able to then go into the cockpit and take control of the aircraft. Apparently, according to the source, they started killing stewardesses as a diversion. The pilot came back to help, and that's how they got into the cockpit, according to this Boston Herald report. Also, according to that report, the suspects did all of this on all 4 of the flights that you're seeing right there, 2 American Airlines flights, 2 United Airlines flights, all originating here on the East Coast from Boston, Logan Airport, from Dulles Airport, from Newark Airport, all heading to California, all heavy with fuel, airline fuel, and apparently, according to the Boston Herald report, the suspects used knives that they had hidden in their shaving kits and other carry-on luggage, and that was how they were able to smuggle these weapons on board. No guns were used, but apparently the knife-like weapons were made up of plastic handles embedded with razor blade, according to sources in this Boston Herald report. Indeed, authorities were led to the rental car by a civilian who apparently said got into some sort of an altercation with these suspects, with several Arab men as they were parking their car, which was apparently some sort of sedan. The man, whose name was not available last night, called state police from an out-of-town airport to report that he had gotten into this argument with these suspects to check out the car. They, in fact, did, and found this Arab language literature as well as training manuals. 2 of the suspects, 2 of the men apparently, whose passports were traced to the United Arab Emirates, are brothers, according to this report, one of whom was a trained pilot. That's all in the Boston Herald. Obviously something, this is a huge crime investigation being launched right now. Federal agents going over the flight manifests on all 4 of these commercial jets, trying to figure out who on board was in fact beyond this, trying to trace this back to the source. Lower Manhattan and the Pentagon, an enormous crime scene, as well as the scene of an enormous tragedy of historic proportions. Recapping the very latest on this unprecedented terrorist attack on the United States, massive and grim searching going on for survivors and bodies. It's going on underway right now in New York after 2 hijacked jetliners slammed into the World Trade Center's Twin Towers. You're looking there at the devastation tonight, early this morning. City buses, whole streets which are just filled with the wreckage, and this is videotape of one of those jets slamming in, the second jet slamming into the second Trade Center tower. You see it just go right in. An unbelievable sight as it, and here's the first jet again. This videotape we just got into our newsroom, a home video. Somebody just happened to be downtown, happened to be rolling and captured that horrifying image. That, the start of what was meant to be, in the minds of the terrorist, a 4-pronged terrorist attack. The 4th jet crashing in the countryside in Pennsylvania. Apparently, authorities believe it might have been on its way to Camp David. But obviously, these are not just the scenes of tragedy, but crime scenes. The FBI will be going over this with a fine-tooth comb, looking for the clues as to who might have been responsible. One of the things that could help, one of the flight attendants on the American Airlines jet, as it was being hijacked, was able to call American Airlines flight operations somehow to report that, in fact, the jet was being hijacked, that two flight attendants had been stabbed. We just heard from that Boston Herald report that was seen as a diversion, a way to get the pilot, lure him out of the cockpit. That flight attendant was able to give the seat number of one of the hijackers, so I'm sure FBI agents will be tracking that down as well, trying to find out from the flight manifest who these people were, trace them back to the terrorist cell that committed this terrible act of terrorism. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani here in New York City says the number of casualties from the Trade Center attacks will be, quote, more than most of us can bear. Officials say establishing the final death toll could, in fact, take weeks. And at the Pentagon, we just saw Jim Sciutto outside there, where it is still burning. Investigators fear hundreds of people were killed when another hijacked jetliner slammed into that building. One wall of the Pentagon has collapsed. You can see there that flames coming out of the windows, and even now at night and early morning as it continues to burn, and the search for victims has really been stalled because of that fire. Folks in the Pentagon are working at defending this country, the very important work that they do there, continuing despite the devastation and tragedy all around them. The military is responding by putting its forces around the world on the very highest alert, and an aircraft carrier due to come home tomorrow from the Persian Gulf has been ordered to remain in the Persian Gulf area indefinitely. Let's go now to ABC News' Barry Serafin, who is in Washington, D.C. Barry, we've been hearing already a lot of talk about quick and swift and severe retaliation. The mood in Capitol Hill tonight?
Well, that's the mood, Elizabeth, but I think cooler heads are going to argue for taking time to make sure that we're right about who was responsible, and indeed if some nation was harboring them. In the meantime, Congress is going to be back at work tomorrow. Both Congress and the White House are determined to show that the government is still up and functioning. And this all after a rather bizarre day in which the president sort of hopscotched around America, and this city emptied out. Not only was the Capitol evacuated, but helicopters were picking up members of Congress and taking them to a bunker about 75 miles outside of Washington in the Blue Ridge Mountains, an old Cold War relic that came in handy for this situation.
And what time, Barry, did all of these congressmen begin being ferried back to the nation's capital? How long were they all evacuated for those hours?
Well, we saw military helicopters picking them up about midday, about 1 o'clock, 1:30, and I guess by late afternoon, 5 o'clock, they were mostly back in town and fired up and ready to talk about this and ready to sing God Bless America.
All right, a symbolic song, but at this point, most gestures are symbolic. We don't know who is responsible for this, and the work at recovering and the victims in this slow and tedious. Thank you, Barry Serafin. We'll be checking back with you in just a few moments. New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani is describing yesterday as one of the most difficult days in the history of the United States. The visibly distraught mayor held a news conference last night. Here is some of what he had to say.
We moved a lot of lights in so that the area is being lit now, so that I don't think the rescue effort is going to be hampered by the darkness. The rescue effort is hampered by the fact that there's still fire there. There are still unsound structures, and it's still dangerous. Yes, we lost the deputy chief of the fire department and the chief of the department.
The chief of the fire department?
The chief of the fire department. The first deputy commissioner.
Mayor, is there still hope that there are people who are still alive and well?
Yes, there's hope. There's hope that there are people that are still alive. People tonight should say a prayer for the people that we've lost, and be grateful that we're all here. And tomorrow, New York is going to be here, and we're going to rebuild, and we're going to be stronger than we were before.
New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani on an exceptionally difficult day. As he just said, we lost perhaps as many as more than 300 firefighters, New York City firefighters, who were in the process of trying to evacuate the World Center Twin Towers when those towers collapsed, killing, presumably, we can only hope that perhaps rescuers will begin to find more survivors buried in that rubble in lower Manhattan instead of just mortalities, more deaths. Immediately after yesterday's attacks, there were calls for swift and strong military response. Among those making such demands was former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger, who spoke earlier this evening with ABC's Peter Jennings.
We're joined now from Virginia by Lawrence Larry Eagleburger, who has served in a variety of very high positions in the U.S. government on previous occasions, and is now still very deeply connected with the rest of the world. Just talk for a minute, Mr. Eagleburger, and tell us what you think after what you've seen.
Well, I think, first of all, we need to understand, if I know my American history, this probably will be the largest casualty rate in one day in the U.S. in our history. The Battle of Antietam stood that record before. I think this is likely to exceed that. That is, in 200 and some years of American history, that is an awful thing to have happen, but it's, I think, happened. And I do not see how we can accept this as anything other than some kind of a declaration of war, and I mean by that a declaration of war by terrorists in general, or at least that's, I think, the way we have to understand it. And that means we have to act against terrorism as if we were at war. That's easy to say, but I really do believe it.
Well, what do you mean by that, Mr. Eagleburger? And I don't think anybody expects you to say anything other than that this evening.
I hope they do.
No, they don't.
Let me tell you what I mean. Let me tell you what I mean.
Please do.
First of all, and the President said it just right tonight, I think we will hold those who have mothered, who have husbanded these terrorists at least as much responsible as the terrorists. I suppose it is important, and it is important, that we try now to establish as clearly as we can who did this. And if it's Osama bin Laden, so be it. That leads me immediately to say that Afghanistan and the Afghani government has a responsibility that is at least as great as Osama bin Laden's. And that means, I think, we must take military action against them. And we must do this, I think, against those states that we understand and see are responsible for these terrorists as much as the terrorists themselves, and that means taking military action against a number of states if, in fact, we have any solid evidence, not that they necessarily did this attack, but that they are those who husband and mother and support terrorist activities in general. I think we now must understand this is more than just a response to the particular people, if we can find it out, who have done this. It is, I think, it must be now, our best efforts must be made to try to make terrorists and the governments who help them understand that the costs of doing this are terribly, terribly high.
Mr. Eagleburger, I hear you being very careful about trying to establish blame first, and I expect that from a man of your stature. Talk a little bit about Afghanistan. Afghanistan has been in a country in absolute turmoil, just riddled with violence for more than a decade, and the United States was party to that in many cases. What could the United States do now to a government in Afghanistan that would make life any worse for them than it is already?
By destroying that government, or by destroying the infrastructure of that government.
You do mean, I gather then, among other things, attacking the capital of Afghanistan, Kabul,
yes.
where the Taliban,
yes,
from which the Taliban rules, and perhaps a city like Kandahar, a large city in the south.
If necessary, if we think it will make
on
the
Afghan
point.
cities.
Sir?
Full-scale attacks on Afghanistan
I would do
cities.
it. Now, look, I understand. I'm one person saying this, and everyone else will be horrified by it. But the point I'm trying to make here is, I think we now need to understand that this is a war. We will have lost some tens of thousands of people, I suspect. And I think we must make it clear to the rest of the world that we're going to be, if you will, somewhat irrational in our response.
I mean neither to agree nor disagree with you. I hope you understand that, first of all, sir. But you are suggesting that the United States now fight on the same level as the people who have committed these acts against the United States?
You betcha. When you fight a war, that is what you do.
Okay, now tell us how difficult it is.
Very. You mean to do this?
Yes.
It would be very difficult. There is no question about that. And I am not, for heaven's sake, arguing that we have to mobilize the whole country. But what I am saying is that when we have a target, when we know that there has been activity, that by supporting terrorists, or we know where the terrorists are, and sometimes when we don't know where they are, but where we know where the governments are, I think we need to mount military attacks. And it will not be easy. There is no question about it. And therefore, I frankly believe that we will not do what I think is going to be necessary. But the point I'm trying to make, and perhaps exaggerating, is I really think we must understand that this is now a war, and that if we don't act, and act vociferously, if you will, violently, if you will, we will see this go on and on and on. And the terrorists, unless they begin to understand that the costs are terribly high, and the governments who house them begin to understand that the costs are terribly high, this is going to continue. And as far as I'm concerned, we are the only ones on the face of the earth that have the ability to make this point to these people, and I understand completely how off the wall many of you will think this is, but I'm serious. I think this is a major crisis. I do not think this great power can stand the loss of some tens of thousands of its citizens without some violent reaction.
Now, Mr. Eagleburger, as you have, and I don't mean to be dispassionate about this either, as you've mulled this over in the course of the day, do you think the United States has the capacity to do it, or you could win a war against international terrorism, exchanging violence for violence?
I think the U.S. has the capacity. Whether we have the will, and I want to be careful here, because I could understand why most people would disagree with me, and I would not argue that it is a weakness of the will if we don't do it. I will say if we have I think we have the means. I think if we have the will, it seems to me that I can't tell you that we win this kind of a war. I'm not at all sure that you can define this as winning or losing, although in the long run I can see the total disaster to our society if we continue to let these things happen. But I do believe that it is possible over time, with the kind of an approach I'm saying here, that we can at least make it so much clearer to everyone, and particularly to the terrorists, and even more importantly to those governments that support them, that at least we will find a substantial diminution of the attacks against the West in general and us in particular. But it won't be done, it won't be won in a hurry, and probably in the last analysis it won't be won at all, but it will, I think, substantially tend to depress the activity.
You know better than most people how difficult it is for a really powerful nation like the United States to hit these little cadres of people and these cells of people around the world. How hamstrung is the United States by being in some respects so powerful? Is it almost muscle-bound in some respects?
No, it's a very good question. I'm not so much muscle-bound, perhaps, as to say that our military structure is built to fight bigger battles than this most of the time. Maybe we need to take some lessons from the Israelis, but I do think we can be restructured. Restructured is even too strong. I think we can put together the kinds of forces that would make this possible without an awful lot of difficulty.
Well, I appreciate your time. This is precisely the debate. Thank you very much for coming in.
And their remarks from former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger, strong remarks calling for strong reaction from the United States after the terrorist attacks. I want to bring you up to date with some more information we're gleaning from this Boston Herald article, which quotes unnamed sources as saying that 5 Arab suspects have now been listed as 5 Arab men have been listed as suspects in yesterday's terrorist attacks. 2 of them brothers who were both on board United Airlines Flight 175. It was en route from Logan's Boston International Airport to Los Angeles. It was the second jet to slam into one of the 2 towers at the World Trade Center this morning. Apparently, another airline passenger at the Boston airport got into an argument with the men. when they were parking their car at the airport. And when he heard after landing in another city about what had happened, called the FBI, said, I think you need to check this out. The FBI has apparently seized the car. It was a rental car that was reportedly being driven by these suspects, several Arab men. And inside they have reported to have found Arab language flight training manuals. One of the two brothers who was on board United Airlines Flight 175 was apparently a trained pilot. There's been a lot of speculation that whoever was behind these hijackings needed to know how to fly this plane. In this article as well are more details that apparently, according to sources, the hijackers began to kill flight attendants on board the plane so as to lure the pilot out of the cockpit, to get him to leave the cockpit, come back into the plane to try and restore some order, and that is the point at which hijackers took control of the cockpit. Several flight attendants were able to call, several passengers were able to call on cell phones, and in addition we're being told that at least one pilot in the cockpit was able to depress his key so that people in the air traffic control tower could hear everything that was going on in the cockpit at the time. They report the hijackers were in fact speaking English to the pilot, reassuring him not to do anything foolish. You're not going to get hurt, which of course was most definitely not the case. And finally, Robert Fitzpatrick, a former second in command of the FBI's Boston office, says that Boston appears to have been the staging area for this attack on New York City and in Washington, D.C., and that the hijackers most likely had help from others who may still be in the Boston area. According to Fitzpatrick, a quote, "There is a terrorist cell operating out of Boston." Again, we want to show you that that website. There is if you have any information for the FBI in this investigation, you can log on to the internet, www.ifccfbi.gov, G-O-V. Any information, of course, in this massive criminal investigation, probably the most massive ever in United States history, underway at this hour as FBI agents pour through flight manifests, try to figure out who was behind this terrible attack. So once again, to recap, we have rescuers down in Lower Manhattan still working, trying to get people from under that rubble. An exhausting and delicate and dangerous task. Many of the buildings there are still considered unstable. Fires still burning. There have been a few survivors pulled from the rubble, pulled from the wreckage after those two twin towers collapsed, and then a third building late yesterday afternoon also collapsing. But at this point, we have absolutely no handle on how many people may have been hurt or killed in this devastating attack. Suffice it to say that the casualties will be massive, as Mayor Giuliani put it here in New York City, more than any of us can bear. Among the casualties, more than 300 firefighters who were trying to evacuate the area. You can see Lower Manhattan it looks like a war zone. It's nothing like it. No electricity. It's being lit by emergency floodlights as crews put in enormous hours for this tremendously difficult task of sorting through the wreckage and the rubble there. While they're doing that, the similar work is going on at the Pentagon, which is still burning at this hour. Flames, in fact, keeping many people from being able to get in and unearth the victims there. Jim Sciutto, ABC's Jim Sciutto, is standing outside there. Jim, any progress on extinguishing the flames at the Pentagon?
We have not seen flames come out of the top of the roof of the Pentagon for quite some time now. As I said a couple of hours ago, what the firemen are doing is called trenching on the roof of the building, where they physically break it open to get access to the flames, but that causes them to jump up because the flames get more oxygen to feed on. But we haven't seen that for quite some time, although they are still, as you can see, spraying the building with water.
And in fact, as they do this, as they extinguish these flames, and as they hope to eventually begin to search for the victims buried there, work continues in the Pentagon. Very important work.
Absolutely. Work continuing in the National Military Command Center, where we don't know that he's left, but until a short time ago, we know that Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld was there with no plans to leave, although we can't confirm that he is still there. That is kind of the headquarters for the military in a situation like this. I can tell you that they actually activated a crisis action in that National Military Command Center even before the plane crashed here at the Pentagon. Once they had word of the first plane hitting one of the World Trade Center towers in New York. They were in a crisis mode here, and then, of course, a plane hit them, although they're on the other side of the building. We also spoke earlier with other offices in the Pentagon that had hundreds of people at work as we speak.
Jim, I know that you're outside the Pentagon, being kept at some distance away because it is obviously a crime scene, a scene of great tragedy, but have you been able to get any information on when, for example, those ships that were sent to come patrol off the coast of New York City, off Washington, D.C., when those aircraft carriers might be arriving?
We just know that they have left. The USS Comfort, a hospital ship out of Baltimore, on its way, and also the aircraft carrier you mentioned on its way as well, but we don't know when they're going to arrive.
All right, Jim Sciutto, thank you so much. Already in lower Manhattan, they have been taking many of the victims. There are all sorts of triage areas, MASH units. Many victims are being ferried from the lower Manhattan over to New Jersey, where they're receiving care there. But obviously, with the massive number of victims and the temporary morgue being set up for the massive number of casualties expected, this is a huge, titanic, logistical nightmare as well for these rescuers who are trying to do so much. Just a few moments ago, we were listening to former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger talk about the swift and severe response. My colleague, ABC's Derek McGinty, is joining me now. Derek, you've been perusing some of these editorials in different newspapers. Strong language there, too.
Indeed. It seems as though the spirit of what Lawrence Eagleburger spoke of, the need to strike back and to need to be very tough and the need to realize that this is not something you can wait for the international legal organizations to deal with, is the spirit especially found in, for example, the Washington Post editorial, which says basically if the attack originated abroad, it is an act of war. Some have even said in that editorial that war should be declared by the U.S. Congress if they can find the nerve to do that. It's the kind of thing where, again, if you look in the historical analog of how we've handled these things in the past, we've sort of waited for the legal system to take its course. For example, with the 2 Libyans that were recently convicted in the bombing of the plane over Lockerbie, they're basically saying that's not enough anymore. If we're going to act, we have to act quickly, and we have to make people know, as Lawrence Eagleburger said, there's a price to be paid when you do these sort of things, and that America has the will to act, and that's what the editorial is saying.
And in fact, as mirroring other comments, which has said any countries harboring this terrorist, i.e. Afghanistan, will bear the consequences of this as well. This is not just an attack on, if, for example, Osama bin Laden was deemed responsible for this, it wouldn't be just retaliation to his cell, but to Afghanistan or any other country sheltering the terrorists.
In fact, President Bush did hint at this in the speech he made tonight, where he said, we will treat the countries that harbor these people the same as we treat these people. I think, as Peter Jennings said so many times earlier, we can't jump to conclusions. We don't know exactly who did this. We don't even know that it was Osama bin Laden, though the evidence seems to point more and more in that direction. But if it turns out to be him or someone else being harbored in some other place, because if you remember, there have been terrorist acts on this country that have supposedly had support from Iraq and other countries. Again, we haven't dealt with it as a national or a war-like problem. We've tried to handle it legally, said, will you extradite this person? Can we go to the World Court for that person? Washington Post and other newspapers basically saying the time for that is done, and it ended yesterday morning at about 9 o'clock.
We're going to be taking a look at some of the headlines from around the country as you and I talk about what many of these editorials are calling for: swift and sure terror in America. The headline on the Detroit Free Press with those astonishing, horrific pictures. A new day of infamy, the headline of the San Antonio Express News. Again, the same horrible pictures, attack on America. The headline in the Tulsa World newspaper. Derek, are other newspapers also calling for, in such strong words as the Washington Post?
Interestingly, the Los Angeles Times was a little bit more measured in its tone, seeming to basically say we have to make sure we know who this is, and that it is up to President Bush to sort of, I guess, make his presidency based on this. One question in the editorial: will he prove to be a Jimmy Carter whose presidency was poisoned by his inability to solve the Iranian hostage crisis, or will he enhance his reputation as Ronald Reagan did after the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger and as Bill Clinton did after the Oklahoma City bombing? So much of our conversation over the last several weeks has been about budgets and lockboxes and that kind of thing. That is pushed to the side now as we concentrate on this immense disaster and what the president does as the leader of this country to sort of rally the country around. I would also note that, as we heard from Gary Langer, basically I think you see public support for just about anything that the president is prepared to do.
This is going to be, for this new president, an enormous test. I mean, no other president has been thus tested this early in his administration.
And, you know, it's interesting. People are comparing this to Pearl Harbor. Again, on the opinion pages, one of the main points that has been made is when Pearl Harbor came, we knew exactly who it was. This time we have just as much tragedy, but not nearly as much clarity in terms of where this came from and who did it. Finding out who did it will require a lot of patience from the American people. I think that if you talk to folks, there is a sense of rage, a sense of violation, and that's the kind of thing that may lead people to want to do rash acts, but patience and knowledge, I think, are key here.
And that is sort of the cautionary words we have to raise once again, even as we do begin to get the first report that these 5 Arab men may be suspects. We have to stress the word may.
Right.
We really don't know who is responsible. And the last thing I think anybody, especially officials, want to do is to spur some sort of vigilante revenge on, or any sort of acts of revenge that people might take into their own hands. It is a time for deliberation in finding out who did this.
Well, as many have said before us, you can't blame communities for the actions of individuals. On the other hand, if countries are harboring these individuals, when you attack a whole country, you know there will be collateral damage, as we heard from Lawrence Eagleburger.
Right.
We've got to be prepared, or to make a decision as to how prepared we are to accept that, to take that.
All right, Derek McGinty, stand by for just one moment. We've been talking, of course, about those 3 commercial airplanes that were hijacked, 2 of them hitting the World Trade Center towers, a 3rd hitting the Pentagon. A 4th plane was also hijacked, we believe possibly headed for Camp David, but it crashed yesterday instead just outside Pittsburgh, killing all 45 people on board. One of those passengers on United Airlines Flight 93 was Mark Bingham, and he was able to call his mother from the airplane on his cell phone. Bingham's mother, Alice Hoagland, spoke with ABC's Peter Jennings a short while ago.
I got on the phone, Mark, and he said, "Hi, Mom, this is Mark Bingham." That would be his last name. And he said, "I want to let you know that I love you. And I'm flying. I think he said I'm in the air. I'm calling you on the airphone of the airplane."
In his seat.
I presume so. He said, I want you to know I love you very much, and I'm calling you from the plane. We've been taken over. There are 3 men that say they have a bomb. And I said, "Well, who are they, Mark?" And he repeated that he loved me, and he said, I don't think he said, "I don't know who they are." He became distracted there as if someone was speaking to him, and he said it's something to the effect of, "It's true," and then the phone.
Terrible remarks from the mother of one of the victims on board those flights, those commercial jets that were hijacked early yesterday morning. We're going to go now to ABC's Bill Blakemore, who is near Ground Zero down near Lower Manhattan, where there is this massive effort underway to get near the wreckage, the rubble, to unearth the victims. Bill, any update you can give us?
Well, they're still working down there with the search and rescue operation. The smoke seems to be slightly less than it was before, but that building is still on fire just to the west of the trade towers, and there's still smoke coming out from the base of the trade towers. It's getting chillier here at night, but the crews are still going down in there, covered with ash, covered with a great deal of dust and soot. There's a lot of heavy machinery down around the edges of the trade towers, what's left of them, moving bits of debris out of the way, but we've had no further word of anybody being found in the rubble. And although we have seen many cases, of course, in earthquake-collapsed buildings where they find people alive even weeks after, there's not a great expectation that there will be many such cases here, because when those 2 towers collapsed in upon themselves, they seem to have almost completely disintegrated in the enormous heat, and the heat went out throughout the day in that area. There still could be, however, people found, and there's always hope.
You were talking earlier, Bill, that there was still concern that some of the buildings near the perimeter of this disaster area might be unstable. And in addition, there are fires still burning that are hampering rescue efforts. How is all that going?
Well, that's part of the big problem, is the fact that they still have firefighting operations as well right next to places that they are trying to rescue people. So it's 2 different kinds of operations all at once. And the fact that a couple of the buildings are still unstable means that they're having to assess bit by bit just exactly where they can take the sniffer dog teams and where they can send people in to try to look for pockets where people might be trapped.
As we talk to you, Bill, we're taking yet another look at this videotape that just came into our newsroom from a home video camera of the first airplane crashing into that tower. We had reports after this. Again, what a horrific scene. We had reports after, as the fire spread in the two twin towers, that people were leaping out of top floors, many of them from the 80th floor. Eyewitness reports that different victims were actually, one man and a woman held hands as they jumped. We presume to escape the flames, knowing full well that it was a choice of leaping to your death as opposed to burning.
Yes, indeed. I talked to some people when I got down here just after that was happening, describing it to me, and they were completely broken up and sobbing as they were telling me about the fact that they had to stand here and watch people leap out of this building at such a great height, because they clearly knew that they were watching people knowing that they were leaping to their death without wanting to have to do that. Apparently the heat just driving them out of the buildings.
Absolutely horrific. And all day and all night over Manhattan, a huge cloud of dust and smoke. You mentioned that that is beginning to clear?
Just a little bit. There's still a very high cloud of smoke just over to the left of me here. That's over to the west, because there's one large building on fire, and it's been on fire since early morning, since the trade tower collapsed right next to it.
All right. All right,
so
Bill, go ahead, finish.
Well, I was just going to say, so that the fire is still not completely out. It's not as bad as it was about 3 hours ago when we had great billows of smoke here. You can still see down at the end of the street, perhaps, that there's one area where there's still a lot of smoke coming out, however, and so they just haven't solved that problem yet.
All right, Bill Blakemore, stand by. We'll be checking back with you in just a few moments. This is obviously tremendously upsetting, not just to the people who witnessed this terrible tragedy, to those people who are impacted in some way, and I think we all are to some extent, but for children as well, this can be a tremendously difficult thing. Derek, you have some information on how to help your kids understand something.
The experts say the key thing for children, as we know in a general sense, is security. They need to know that they're safe. And even though you and I may watch this and not feel a sense of personal danger, at least not right at the minute, children don't have that same sense of security. So one of the things they tell you is make sure that, though it may seem obvious, spell out that members of the immediate family are safe. Mom, dad, brother, sister, even grandma and granddad, especially if they live far away, that they're safe. Let kids know that the structure of their daily lives is not going to change much because they draw security from these things. And one of the things that I think is so important, if your children are very young and not really emotionally ready, and only a parent can tell whether that's the case, you know, don't put the TV on all day and let them watch it unfold, even though you might want to do it yourself, because it may be too much and it may upset them, and there's no way you can explain to them exactly what's going on. Try to be reassuring, and if you do get really upset, let them know you're not upset with them. Explain that this is an upsetting situation and that the leaders and the president and people they understand exist are going to take care of this, or at least keep them safe.
It's difficult because so much of America right now is tuned into television sets because this information is unfolding so minute by minute.
Right.
And to see that, to see the unthinkable actually happening for adults is tough enough, but for the children nearby to see this must really disrupt all sense of safety.
It is. And, you know, young children are more able to handle it when it's maybe presented in print rather than on the television.
Right.
You know, the pictures are so immediate, they almost defy description, and even you and I are horrified over and over again as we watch that home video of the plane hitting the side of the building. It looks like, you know, something out of a movie somewhere. You just can't believe it's going on. But it is. Well, imagine how a 5-year-old sees that. They can't really understand it. So maybe you ought to try to show them a newspaper or some other way of looking at it so they can understand it better. One other thing, you know, we've shown people what it's like down in the southern tip of Manhattan, but you know the rest of New York City is struggling with this as well. And you know, I got a call from someone who lives in Battery Park City, which is right next to the World Trade Center. The woman was hysterical, in tears, basically saying, I can't ever go back to my apartment. I'm afraid to ever return there. And I said, you will eventually go back, just not today. But I got to think there are any number of people reacting just as strongly to this who aren't physically hurt, but are mentally just shocked by this.
Well, it was interesting. Gary Langer had some polling data. He was here a few moments ago and said that according to his numbers, many Americans felt, a big chunk of Americans felt that another act of terrorism could happen, that in fact this was just the beginning of a terrible sort of wave of terrorist attacks.
Well,
so,
I think...
in fact, here we 87% worried about more attacks, 47% worried about themselves being a victim of an attack.
Well, I think the horror of this attack, and again, here in New York City, this isn't the first time they've been through this. The World Trade Center was attacked in '93. It happens once or twice, you can begin to get over it. When it happens on this level again,
like this.
nothing, you
commercial jets
exactly
being, crashed into buildings is nothing like this has ever occurred. Derek, thank you for that great advice for parents trying to soothe children understandably devastated and upset by what happened. We did want to tell you that according to a report in the Boston Herald this morning, the FBI already well on its way to trying to find the suspects, the people behind this terrorist attack, have identified at least 5 Arab men as potential suspects. According to the report, another passenger at the airplane had gotten into a little bit of an altercation with these men as they were parking their car. Inside the car, the rental car that was left at Boston Logan Airport, FBI agents say they have found, according to this Boston Herald report, Arabic language flight training manuals, which of course would be significant since many people believe that whoever hijacked these planes in this incredibly, stunningly well-orchestrated terrorist attack would need to know how to fly the plane. So Robert Fitzpatrick, the former second command of the FBI's Boston office, says that the city of Boston does appear to be the staging area for this attack. 2 of the 5 suspects are brothers, one of whom is a pilot. They were on board United Airlines Flight 175, which was the second jet to crash into the World Trade Center tower. We have now a graphic with what we do know so far about the death toll, which we've been cautioned. We won't know for weeks the final toll of victims, but as of this moment right now, 267 people were killed on all 4 hijacked airplanes. The Pentagon estimates there could be up to 800 dead at the Pentagon. However, that number could drop, and as ABC's Jim Sciutto was telling us earlier, that number could have been much higher had they not had those special Mylar coating on the windows there to help prevent those windows from exploding on impact, thus saving other people's lives, collateral damage in that attack there. But it could be weeks before we know the final death toll, the final grim number of people who've been so terribly impacted in this attack. Now, when flights do resume at the United States airports, passengers will no longer be able to check their bags at the curb in front of terminals, obviously. Air travelers will also be subject to random security checks. There will be more uniformed security officers seen at the airports. ABC's Lisa Stark has more now on the fallout from the terrorist attacks in New York City and at the Pentagon.
It now appears that the weapon of choice appears to have been knives on board these planes. We know from reports from our sources and others that reports from flight attendants on an American flight and from passengers on 2 different flights we're now learning. The United flight that went into the World Trade Tower as well as the flight that went into the Pentagon. Cell phone calls from passengers on both those flights reported that men were on board with knives or box cutters, that flight attendants had been injured or killed, that people had stormed the cockpit. We also learned that on one of the flights, the American Airlines flight that went into the World Trade Tower, the flight attendant was also able to tell the American Airlines Operations Center, she reached them and told them what was going on board. She was able to tell them the actual seat number of the passenger who was causing the problems on the plane. So that may lead authorities at least to one name, at least the name of the person who booked that ticket. She was able to give that information to the people at American Airlines. Obviously, this was a major security breach at 3 U.S. airports. There will be a lot of talk, as there is already, about how this could possibly have happened. One person told me these are obviously shocking events, but not that surprising. There have been a number of reports throughout the years about security problems at U.S. airports.
And that was ABC's Lisa Stark speaking over yet another horrific image of that second jet, that United Airlines jet crashing into the World Trade Twin Towers this morning. The U.S. military around the world is on high alert. It's called DEFCON 3, and is a very rare state. ABC's Josh Gerstein is at Lafayette Park near the White House. Josh, what can you tell us about this level of alert and how long the U.S. military might be at this level?
Well, we understand from White House officials that President Bush ordered this level of alert as he traveled from Florida to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. As you say, it is DEFCON 3. There are 5 levels that dealing with the strategic forces, the nuclear forces, even if you will, of the United States, and he ordered that raised to DEFCON 3. There's also something in effect called THREATCON Delta. That has to do with the security of the forces, the way they are deployed, the actual threat against U.S. forces, the precautions they have to take around military bases. I don't think we know how long all those precautions will be in effect, but we do know that the president himself was under very, very unusual military security today as Air Force One flew through the skies, hopscotching the country, as you've noted earlier. It was accompanied by F-15s and F-16s. Air Force One flying, as you may remember from movies or something like that, but this was actually real life, flying with a military fighter escort. And then with the president arriving back here in Washington late in the day, around 6 p.m., there were 6 helicopters flying over the National Mall, obviously decoys to distract anybody that might be there looking to do the president harm. The first 2 helicopters peeled off. The third one headed into the south lawn of the White House, and the other 3 landed along the National Mall. Extraordinary security precautions being taken with the president earlier in the day.
Indeed.
Elizabeth?
All right, Josh, thank you so much for that report. Extraordinary throughout the day, from the very beginning of this terrible attack to what this country has now put into effect with this extraordinarily high security, military on alert, aircraft carriers being deployed, ships that are literally floating hospitals being sent to come help deal with the injured and the dead here in Manhattan, in lower Manhattan, which is obviously, people who down there have described it as an incredible war zone. Derek McGinty, my colleague, is joining me here. We were both just comparing stories about how surreal, not just in lower Manhattan, but the entire, first of all, the streets are deserted, which you never see.
Not at 10 o'clock at night in New York City. On the way to work tonight, many times I take a cab. There were no cabs tonight to come to work. I walked. It's little things. You go in the store, maybe they're low on water or other supplies because they haven't had deliveries today, because obviously the roads have been blocked off. People are not out, not in the usual sort of celebratory nighttime mood that you have here in New York City. There is a sense that something horrible has happened and they're still trying to get their minds around it. Interestingly, there are some very concrete things as well. There was an election in New York today, or at least there was going to be a primary election. It started off, the polls opened, I believe, at 6 a.m., but after this happened, they closed the polls, and there's no word yet on exactly when they'll recast the ballot for mayor in the primary election here in New York City. In Washington, D.C., where they have Mayor Tony Williams has declared a state of emergency and so forth, he has recommended that they cancel a meeting a week and a half from now of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. He just says after this we need to look at the security of it, and wondering if the city will be ready to handle this in the aftermath of the cleanup.
That's just one of several events being canceled. We've already heard about the Primetime Emmy Awards that were scheduled for this week and the Latin Grammy Awards, which are scheduled soon. All of this has been canceled.
And one of the things that has almost never happened, professional baseball canceled all its games. That's
First
almost
time since D-Day.
Yeah, it's almost unheard of.
Well, in addition to that, the unprecedented move by the FAA today to cancel all flights, literally all flight space, all airspace over the United States of America since yesterday morning has been closed. Flights that were in the air were diverted to Canada. Some of them were allowed to land, but literally when we weren't entirely sure about the depth and breadth of this terrorist attack, that it was very important to get all those airplanes out of the air and on the ground so they would not be susceptible to any further hijackings. Again, right now the FAA has planned to reopen the airspace, the nation's airspace, perhaps at noon today, perhaps not. Mail delivery will be on a very limited basis throughout this country. Congress and federal offices in the nation's capital will in fact be open. Stock markets, however, will be closed today. Limited postal deliveries nationwide. Schools in both Washington, D.C. and New York City have canceled all classes today. And as we said, lots of folks stranded at airports all over the country waiting for the nation's airways and skies to open up once again to do business, because with the 36,000 to 40,000 flights a day, that is wreaking havoc throughout not only our country but the rest of the world as well. To those of you just joining us this morning, good morning. This is ABC's live continuing coverage of the deadly terrorist attacks on the United States. I'm Elizabeth Vargas. At this hour, emergency crews are still trying to reach victims of the devastating assault on the World Trade Center. An attack by 2 hijacked airplanes has reduced the Trade Center's twin towers to a mountain of twisted steel and broken glass. At the Pentagon, rescue crews are also facing a long, grim day today. Officials fear hundreds may have died when a third hijacked jetliner slammed into the Pentagon, knocking down, in fact, one of the walls. The Pentagon, as we have been told, you can see there, victims lined up. One of the walls of the Pentagon has collapsed. The Pentagon continues to burn, even as people work inside the Pentagon to try and deal with this military crisis. ABC's Barry Serafin is in Washington. Barry, Congress and the President both vowing to get right back to work today.
Elizabeth, Congress, the President, federal agencies all want to present a picture of normalcy as much as possible, of business as usual, but of course it isn't. That grim work continues at the Pentagon. The city is still in a state of emergency. There are still high security and cordons around major buildings in this city. And it's just not going to be normal despite the best efforts of those in charge.
Indeed not. I mean, a lot of this is entirely symbolic because we don't know anything yet. We're still dealing not only with not knowing who's responsible, we don't even know how bad this is yet.
No, we don't. And the whole mood of this city is still very much one of shock. You mentioned a little while ago, I'd like to talk a little more about it. There's a meeting scheduled a week and a half from now of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in this city. The police have been preparing for it for weeks. They've been expecting tens of thousands of demonstrators at that meeting. And now the D.C. police and some city officials are recommending that that meeting be postponed. I think it's partly a feeling that the city and the country will still be in mourning, and I think it's partly just a matter of no one has the appetite for that kind of event in the wake of this.
Indeed. All right, Barry Serafin, thank you for that report. We're going to go now to ABC's Bill Blakemore, who is near ground zero of this disaster in Manhattan, lower Manhattan. He is down near where the Twin Trade Center towers collapsed and where an enormous rescue and search operation is underway. Bill, any progress by rescue crews?
We're beginning to see much more activity. We're hearing jackhammers. There are people in there with acetylene and torches. They're beginning the long process of trying to take this wreckage apart. Something we know, of course, that takes a great deal of time. We've seen in many earthquakes that it takes a great deal of time to take buildings apart, especially if you're hoping there'll be people alive inside, because you just don't want to bulldoze them away. So they're beginning to pick away at it around the edges, but we can see there is still smoke coming from the ruins, from the wreckage of what's left of the trade tower. There's still a couple of buildings on fire next to that wreckage.
And in fact, we've had reports that there were a couple of Port Authority police officers who were pulled from the wreckage alive. Is that still a terrible rarity at this point, that we're finding anybody still alive?
I'm afraid we haven't heard anything since then, and that was a few hours ago that we heard that they found a very small handful of people that they were able to extract from the wreckage who were still alive, but we haven't heard any further good news of that kind since then. People who have been right into the base of where the trade towers were standing, who've been able to get as close as they could in spite of the heat, report that it was so intensely hot there during the day and seems so completely decimated now that it's very hard to imagine there's anybody alive. But of course, in all of these situations, as we've seen in earthquakes as well, where there are great collapsed buildings, people keep hope alive. There's always the possibility that there are some pockets down below where eventually they'll be able to get to someone.
All right, Bill Blakemore, thanks so much. Derek McGinty, my colleague, is joining me here. You've got some information on how the stock market's reacting.
Well, you know, we keep hearing the phrase business as usual, at least when it comes to the government. They're trying to promote the idea that we are unbowed by this, that the country will continue on. But it is anything but business as usual for the world of business. For one thing, the stock market, which is very much affected by being in that part of town where the World Trade Center disaster has occurred, is closed, and it won't be open tomorrow at all. Well, without that guidance from the stock market, the markets all around the world, all interconnected, as we know, are looking for guidance. It's not there. The stock prices in Asia were plummeting today after that because, you know, again, it's such a shock. And some are likening it to the Gulf War, which led to a major recession around the world.
In fact, the Trade Center towers were really the heart of in this financial district that, you know, spans the globe. What kind of impact might this have long term, not just on, you know, destroying those towers, but to lose all those documents, to lose all this information and all these people?
Well, you know, I think the people aspect is what everybody's been focusing on, and rightly so. We just don't know from the other side of things how the markets will react. I mean, there seems to be two schools of thought here. Some say this is a long-term disaster, that it'll be very, very difficult for the markets to recover, that this could be the thing that sort of tips it over into a recession that we've been sort of flirting with for the last several months. But others point out that the markets have been very resilient, and that at times of stress it will look bad for a while, but as this country pulls together, so will the market, and that we'll begin to see some sort of recovery. It's really too soon to say, that's just like we have to say about so much of this.
Our colleague Diane Sawyer was actually reporting a few hours ago and was talking about the fact that everywhere down there on that scene you could see financial records and papers, just everywhere you looked, you know, litter from this terrible, terrible explosion, documents that were so important yesterday and now have become just...
Yeah, so much of that, though, I think is also on computers and so forth. We just don't know how much is destroyed, how much is duplicated somewhere else. You just don't know. I mean, there's just no way for us to say what the sort of the tangible impact of this will be on the markets and the ability of companies to continue to do business once we begin to have the cleanup in place. Once people do go back to work in that part of town, we don't know how hard it's going to be for them to sort of jumpstart and get back to where they were before.
All right. Well, despite heavy damage at the Pentagon, thanks, Derek, despite that attack and despite damage and the fire burning and victims there, the Pentagon is scheduled to be open today. In fact, it is open as of now, even as officials deal with what appears to be a very high death toll. ABC's Jim Sciutto is outside the Pentagon. Folks working there even as we speak.
Absolutely, Elizabeth. Still active. And I think we have noticed a little bit less smoke in about the last hour, a sense that the fire is coming somewhat under control. There used to be 3 or 4 hoses spraying the roof of the Pentagon. Now we're just down to 1. Still a lot of smoke, as you can see, but noticeably less in the last hour. So a sense that they are making progress, at least.
Firefighters making headway in both the Washington, D.C. and in New York. Jim, how much of that building, or of that complex, in essence, will in fact be operational tomorrow?
If you can picture the Pentagon, as you know, of course, it's 5-sided. It has 10 corridors emanating out from the center, like the spokes of a wheel. Tomorrow, apparently between 2 and 6, quarter number 2 and quarter number 6, that area is going to be closed off. A little more than a third of the building closed off tomorrow morning, but the rest of the building up and running. And as we've talked about many times tonight, it's running as we speak. The National Military Command Center, where the Secretary of Defense was for much of the evening. He may still be there. Pentagon not telling us either way. Also, other offices. We spoke with someone who called us actually a couple of hours ago and said just in his unit alone, 500 to 1,000 people at work tonight. So a building that has been greatly damaged. The plane went 3 rings into the building. It's 5 concentric rings in the Pentagon, and yet it's still active.
All right, Jim Sciutto, thank you so much for that report. Demands for a swift and strong military response followed yesterday's deadly attacks. They came from, among others, former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger, who spoke with ABC's Peter Jennings.
Afghanistan has been in a country in absolute turmoil, just riddled with violence for more than a decade, and the United States was party to that in many cases. What could the United States do now to a government in Afghanistan that would make life any worse for them than it is already?
By destroying that government, or by destroying the infrastructure of that government. Look, I understand that particularly in a case like Afghanistan, you have 150 years of this kind of instability. That doesn't mean, what it does mean, I think, though, is that if we're going to judge these issues precisely with the kinds of questions you've asked, much as they have to be asked, and we then decide because there is not a lot that can be done, that we shouldn't do anything, I think that's the wrong approach, and I think if the terrorists and the governments who house them are made to pay prices for it, and again, I can't believe that the government in Kabul would take kindly to having its government buildings blown up under them or over them.
But
I think there are things we could do.
You do mean, I gather then, among other things, attacking the capital of Afghanistan, Kabul,
if necessary. Yes.
where the Taliban,
yes,
from which the Taliban rules, and perhaps a city like Kandahar, large city in the south.
If necessary, if we think it's, if we think it will make the point.
Cities.
Sir?
Full-scale attacks on Afghanistan
I would do it. Now, look, I understand. I'm one person saying this, and everyone else will be horrified by it. But the point I'm trying to make here is, I think we now need to understand that this is a war. We will have lost some tens of thousands of people, I suspect, and I think we must make it clear to the rest of the world that we're going to be, if you will, somewhat irrational in our response.
I mean neither to agree nor disagree with you. I hope you understand that, first of all, sir. But you are suggesting that the United States now fight on the same level as the people who have committed these acts against the United States.
You betcha. When you fight a war, that is what you do.
And you must be ready to live with the consequences of fighting. That's strong remarks tonight from former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger. We go now to ABC's Rebecca Cooper, who is in Washington, D.C. Rebecca, you've been talking with some senior intelligence sources, I know, throughout the evening. Any idea yet how we, who are supposed to be the best in the world in intelligence, missed any sort of sign, any clue that this attack was coming?
Elizabeth, senior intelligence officials tell us that, in fact, there were no specific signs that this was coming. In fact, not only were we not receiving any general threats, but we were at a lower state of threat than we had been in many recent weeks and months. So they say there were no specific threats, there was nothing that pointed to the time or place, and there was certainly not a heightened state of alarm within the United States. There had been some increased concern for American citizens traveling to Israel and other parts of the Middle East, but there were no concerns seen here in the United States. So now the concern becomes for the White House, for the Central Intelligence Agency, and other parts of the national security apparatus. What do they do to anticipate further attacks in the future, given that there were no signs that led to this?
And what is the answer to that? I mean, are they just trying to figure out how now to beef up intelligence agencies, connections, sources, that sort of thing around the world?
They have that challenge before them. Last night after the president's speech, he went immediately in to what's called the sit room, the situation room inside the basement of the White House. It's a heavily armored room that's like a bank vault, where he met with his national security officials and got a very frank and firm assessment of the situation from CIA Director George Tenet. And administration officials tell ABC News that following that meeting, they acknowledge they have the very real concern about how to do that in the future. They still have to determine once and for all who is responsible. Administration officials telling ABC News that all signs certainly do point to Osama bin Laden, and they have mounting evidence to make that case as the hours go by, but they're not ruling out other possible sources of attack. But they also have an additional concern, which is if it is indeed Osama bin Laden, how do they retaliate? It's not a nation, it's a widespread terrorist cell, and as one senior terrorism official noted to me earlier, other than a bunch of mud huts, we don't know exactly who and what to attack. They don't know where Osama bin Laden is on any given day.
Although there have been several remarks tonight that from different sources in the administration and even comments from President Bush to the effect that countries providing safe harbor to these terrorists will pay the price. So even if we don't know exactly where Osama bin Laden is, if, and that's a big if, we determine that he is in fact behind this terrorist attack, they seem to be not ruling out attacks on whatever country is giving him harbor.
Exactly. You've done in your own reporting in the past, Elizabeth, the ever-present danger to American citizens traveling abroad. And there are several countries that American citizens have been warned from traveling to because they do harbor known terrorists. Afghanistan has been a country of real concern, and the United States has consistently warned them in the past that actions would be taken if they continued to harbor terrorists, but took no real specific action. We are now being told to expect all of that to change in the wake of yesterday's attack.
Indeed, I think safe to say life in the United States for every American will change after what has happened. Thank you, Rebecca Cooper from Washington. We'll be checking back in with you a little bit later. ABC's Derek McGinty, my colleague, is here. You've been keeping track of different stock market reaction around the world. Already markets having a tremendously adverse reaction.
Well, beyond the obvious human cost here, the tremendous human cost here, the other big casualty seems to be confidence. In Japan, the Nikkei average, which is their stock market, their Dow Jones, is down more than 6%, and it's because a lot of investors are running scared. Interestingly, gold, which is sort of considered the safe harbor, when things are bad, people buy gold. The price of gold is up right now. The dollar itself is a lot lower. One of the things to keep in mind was that several very important Japanese banks, in fact 31 of them, had offices in the World Trade Center. Those offices now obviously destroyed again. The impact is fundamentally on those tangible assets, but on confidence, which, as you know, is sort of the currency that investors trade in, and without it, we just don't know how the market will react. Again, the U.S. markets are closed today, Wednesday, and they will decide later today when to reopen them, if it will be Thursday, Friday, or whenever that will be, depending depending on what goes on.
All right, Derek, thanks so much. Authorities say the hijackings of the 3 planes that crashed in New York City and Washington, D.C., along with that 4th jet that went down near Pittsburgh, were closely coordinated, obviously, by these terrorists. ABC's Lisa Stark reports now on the timeline.
The first plane to crash into the Twin Towers was this Boeing 767, American Airlines Flight 11. The plane with 92 passengers and crew left Boston around 8 a.m., heading for Los Angeles. About a half hour into the flight, it made a hard left turn over upstate New York. There were violent changes in airspeed. The plane turned and headed toward Manhattan. It slowed and aimed right for the World Trade Tower. At the same time, this United 767, Flight 175, 65 people on board, also going from Boston to Los Angeles, is flying over Massachusetts. It turns toward New Jersey. The jet then makes a U-turn over the state, comes toward Manhattan from the south over Staten Island. It slams into the second World Trade Tower. Both planes were in the air about 45 minutes. Even before the towers are hit, this American Airlines 757, Flight 77, has left Washington's Dulles Airport bound for Los Angeles. It's believed the plane was in the air for over an hour before it destroyed a section of the Pentagon. This is all that's left of United Airlines Flight 93. It left Newark bound for San Francisco. It appears hijackers took control somewhere over Cleveland. The plane took a hard turn to the south. Then someone in the cockpit radioed that the plane wanted to change flight plans and head to Washington, D.C. It never made it, disappearing from radar, crashing south of Pittsburgh.
And there is, of course, speculation that plane, the hijackers had meant for that plane to go and crash in or near Camp David, again, crashing instead in the Pennsylvania countryside. Yet another airplane, aside from those 4 jets, had a close call yesterday. The pilot of TWA Flight number 3, bound from New York City to St. Louis, came perilously close to one of the planes that crashed into the World Trade Center. ABC's Dean Reynolds reports the TWA pilot was told to take evasive action.
You dodged one of the aircraft that hit the tower?
Well, he was up there whenever we were coming from New York, so what we had to do was, they were not talking to him, and he was changing his heading and his altitude, so they just cleared us to deviate however we had to stay away from him.
It was right after they had taken off, and the passengers were horrified.
I thought we were going to crash. I thought the plane was going to crash, because when we took off, the plane kind of went down and came back up, it was kind of shaking, and it wasn't your normal taking off routine. And then you could just see like a plane that just kind of just bypassed us really close, and I said maybe it was just a mere miss.
We had him in sight, so it was a nice day in New York. We were out of the clouds, which helped a lot, so we just, dodged him.
As the TWA jet ascended, others aboard said they could see a terrible sight below.
Then when we got really high up, our brother's a fireman, and so I said, doesn't it look like the Trade Center's on fire? And he says, yeah, it does. It looks like a big fire.
All right, that was ABC's Dean Reynolds with that report. Obviously, the World Trade Center was on fire in a devastating way. We're going to go now to ABC's Allison Stewart, who is down near Ground Zero, where Bill Blakemore has been also standing by. Allison was able to spend some time in some area hospitals. As you can imagine, with a disaster this size, the effort to get the victims out and to get them help is enormous. Allison, you were able to spend some time at the hospitals. Where are the wounded being taken?
As far as I know, Elizabeth, the time I spent today was at St. Vincent's Hospital, which is at 7th Avenue and 12th Street. They're actually using 7th Avenue as somewhat of a corridor for all large tractors, trailers, ambulances, New York City MTA buses, which no longer have their routes on the top, but they say emergency call police. While I was down there, I spent several hours this afternoon, a phalanx of medical professionals volunteering their time, gurneys on the street, awaiting people to come in. But as everyone noted, that most of the people who were coming in earlier today were not the severely wounded who are unfortunately still in the rubble behind me. They were the people who were running and hit by debris. One thing I did note is that they were not taking blood donations any longer, but they needed donations of clothing. They were asking for people to bring clothing down to St. Vincent's Hospital for the people who had suffered burns or had lost shirts, shoes. They especially needed shoes, they said.
And they want people to actually bring those items to the hospital?
Yes, there was a large bin that said, "We need clothing donated," and that they would begin collecting blood again at 9 a.m. this morning.
Well, and in fact, I know that they were actually saying that many New Yorkers spent the afternoon lined up waiting to donate blood, what little they could do to help this in this terrible event. But at some point they were saying, look, what we really need is O-negative blood and RH factor negative blood. Is that correct?
Absolutely. That's what they were saying as well. And it was amazing how they just pulled it together so suddenly, writing signs on the back of pizza boxes, the different lines for the types of blood written on garbage bags, paper garbage bags you get at the supermarket.
And what about the effort? We'd heard reports that MASH units had been established, or treatment units had been established, that people are being ferried from the lower tip of Manhattan to New Jersey across the river.
Actually, you know what? I haven't been at that part of any of the efforts. I've only been at the hospital and down here, Elizabeth.
I understand. Thank you so much, Allison. We'll be checking back in with you in just a moment. I'm sorry, we're going where? Okay, well, we're going to recap while we figure out what we're going to do next. The landscape of lower Manhattan in the moments following the attacks was one of unimaginable destruction and terror. Joe Torres of WABC television brings us this report.
You know, as reporters and as journalists, we are in the business of gathering news. And during events such as these, you've seen the video, you've seen the pictures, to try and cover it as best we can, we try and get as close to the scene as possible, thinking of the story, thinking of the viewers first, ourselves second. That was a mistake, and we almost paid for it. Let's go! Underground! I'm with you! Go! 10 o'clock this morning, photographer Glenn Mayrose and I, along with FBI agents, police officers, fire officials, we all thought for sure a bomb was set to explode underneath our feet outside 7 World Trade Center. We took off running for our lives north on Church Street. We had no idea the top of one of the Twin Towers had just exploded. We ran 5, 6 blocks, Glenn lugging his camera equipment, videotapes, and batteries as a cloud of smoke, dust, and debris crept up behind us. People running, crying, and screaming, wiping tears from their eyes. Out of breath and unsure of what just happened and what we just experienced, we finally stopped, took a breath to make sure we and others were okay. We finally paused and talked to this gentleman, covered entirely in dust and debris. As others looked back in shock and horror, we started another interview with a Port Authority engineer who worked at World Trade Center and spoke to us about the strength and integrity of the skyscrapers. Then, suddenly, the second tower erupted right before our eyes. Oh, no. Moments later, the frantic run up Church Street started all over again.
Report from WABC television, Joe Torres, who was on the scene this morning when all that unfolded. Just horrific events that he witnessed and also experienced while down there. We want to show you once again the picture, the home video we got in here a few hours ago of the first tower of the World Trade Center being struck by that jet. A home video. Somebody happened to be there. You can see it up there. Unbelievable. The commercial jet hits the first tower, explodes, and at that point, of course, pandemonium began. And then a few moments later, we've got the videotape, a second jet. While the first tower burned, a second jet hijacked. This is a United Airlines jet bound for Los Angeles from Boston, crashing also again into the second tower of the World Trade Center. We now know that the FBI has singled out two brothers who were on board that flight as potential suspects. We have some videotape. Moments ago, the FBI seized a car, their rental car. The car apparently rented by 5 Arab men and parked in Boston Logan's airport. Was seized as evidence a few moments ago. You can see it being towed away right there. There is a report in the Boston Herald, I believe, Derek McGinty, you have it with you, that the FBI got sort of hooked onto these suspects because another passenger had gotten into an altercation with these men, noticed them, thought that something was suspicious, and inside that car, according to this report in the Boston newspaper, they found Arab language flight manuals.
Yeah, this is a source story from the Boston Herald, so we ought to emphasize again and again that we don't have independent confirmation of this information, but
we do have independent confirmation that the car
was towed, right, but we don't have independent confirmation of some of the details they bring out here, but they are fascinating because the question everybody asks is, how could this happen? We've all been through the metal detectors. You got to take your keys out of your pocket. You can't bring your cell phone on without showing somebody that it actually is a working cell phone. How could someone get weapons on a plane under this level of security? Well, apparently, according to the sources in this Boston Herald story, they were ingenious about it. They had knife-like weapons hidden in shaving kits and embedded in razor blades and so forth that were in their carry-on luggage, things that would go right through the X-ray detection equipment, and no one might notice that it was a possible weapon.
And in fact, the FBI, former head of the FBI in Boston, believes that Boston was the staging area for this incredibly sophisticated, stunningly choreographed terrorist attack. 4 commercial airline jets being hijacked nearly simultaneously yesterday morning as they were all taking off for long flights bound for California, laden with jet fuel that is highly flammable.
And planes that were didn't have many passengers on board, so that there was no sense that maybe a group of passengers could take over the plane again or get or attack the suspects and possibly thwart them. Interestingly, one of the planes took off from Dulles Airport, as we noted, the one that ended up crashing into the Pentagon. That plane was in the air for an hour. Well, if you're from the area, you know the Dulles Airport is maybe 2 minutes away from the Pentagon via airplane. So that plane circled around or moved, just stayed on course for a long time, waiting apparently for just the right time to smack into the Pentagon.
And other details in this newspaper report on how this attack had happened. And this has obviously also been confirmed because so many passengers were calling from cell phones. An American Airlines flight attendant was able to call American Airlines operations and say they were being hijacked, that stewardesses were being stabbed, and apparently there is speculation now that the hijackers began to kill the flight attendants as a ruse, a way of luring the pilot out of the cockpit so that they could then storm the cockpit and take control. According to the report also, we hear that one of the pilots was able to depress his key while he was communicating to air traffic control. And they were able to overhear the hijackers warning the pilot in English not to do anything foolish, that he would not be hurt.
Yeah, there's so much that we may never know from these planes because of what happened and whether or not they can recover the black boxes that were on board. But the flight that crashed outside Pittsburgh, that's the plane that something went wrong for the hijackers. There's something didn't go as expected. That's where we'd like to know. Maybe we could find out more about it if we could just get those details.
The FBI now also, thank you, Derek, the FBI is apparently also, because so many people were able to use their cell phones to call their loved ones from the airplane when it became clear that they were in terrible trouble. The FBI now backtracking and tracing all those cell phone records because they're going to want to go back and speak to as many of those people as they can to glean what information they can about what was happening and going on in the air. Up we have now some help information helplines to call the FBI if you do have any information at all about anything about what might have happened, what might have led to this attack, who might be behind it. You can call 1-800-331-0075. For information on victims, call 1-800-331-0075 once again. This is ABC's continuing live coverage of the terrorist attacks on the United States. A massive rescue and recovery operation is still unfolding at the site of the World Trade Center. A devastating attack by 2 hijacked airplanes has reduced the Trade Center's twin towers to a perilous mountain of rubble. Fires are still burning at the Pentagon, where another hijacked plane caused extensive damage when it crashed into the Pentagon. You can see one of the Pentagon's walls has, in fact, collapsed. Reports are that flames are still burning inside. Crews are searching for possibly hundreds of victims there. ABC's Allison Stewart is down near Ground Zero here in New York in Lower Manhattan, where the terrible task of wading through this rubble and finding the victims is underway. Allison, I know that they've been able to stabilize the scene slightly. The fires are close to out now?
Apparently, Elizabeth, they have very few firefighters. This is according to Don Dailer of ABC's Good Morning America, that they have very few firefighters gingerly, tenderly walking over the rubble, listening for people. They are concerned there is some fire still burning right at the base of the area.
And the buildings at the scene were, for many, many hours, considered unstable. We did have that third building collapse late yesterday afternoon, and there was some concern as recently as a couple of hours ago that some of those other buildings were still unstable. Do you know if they've been able to make sure that everything is okay in that respect?
Apparently they are concerned about the Marriott Hotel. There is some fire burning in the Marriott Hotel right now, and they're worried about the stability of that building, Elizabeth.
And you came from St. Vincent's Hospital, one of many area hospitals where victims are being taken. What was the scene like there?
At St. Vincent's, I was there earlier in the evening. I haven't been there recently. It was a case of people wanting to actually volunteer. There were so many doctors and medical professionals come down, as well as an entire building for people who wanted, just civilians who were on the street and wanted to volunteer. I met a young Mexican man who said he was a medical professional during the earthquake in '85 there, and he just wanted to come down and help. There are people actually at the perimeter here who also want to help, but I have to tell you, Elizabeth, getting in here as a member of the press was quite difficult. This is locked down. The National Guard and the police are at every entrance to the tip of Manhattan today. It's quite chilling, and you realize how truly that this is a crime scene, and that's the way they're treating it.
It's an enormous crime scene, and the FBI will be combing through that debris as well, looking for evidence. And I'm sorry, can we tell me? Let's go check in now with ABC's Nathan Thomas, who's been monitoring events overseas.
Good morning, Elizabeth. All over the world, people have been glued to their television sets watching the horror in America and wondering how it's going to affect them. At the U.S. Embassy here in London, there was a candlelight vigil overnight. People far from home and trapped. All flights to the U.S. remain canceled. The British government feared a similar attack. They've closed the airspace over London. Some office buildings may remain closed again today here. Security is tight, as it is at embassies, U.S. embassies all over the world, which are temporarily closed to the public. In Moscow, people brought flowers to the American embassy. One man described what so many feel when he said he thought he'd been watching a science fiction film. The Israeli government declared a day of mourning. They began collecting blood to send to American victims. At one center in Jerusalem, a doctor said 150 donors showed up there in 2 hours. But in East Jerusalem, celebrations from the Palestinians and in Palestinian camps. They say they are very unhappy with the U.S. siding in Israel, and some say this is what the U.S. deserves.
Indeed, even as PLO chief Yasser Arafat condemned the attack, we saw videotape yesterday of Palestinian men and young boys, actually, cheering and elated by the attack.
That's right, but there is one commentator from the Mideast who said that many Palestinians, the people in the streets, are not really that many when you count all the Palestinians. Many of them are on their knees praying right now that it doesn't turn out that they or any of their people had anything to do with this attack.
It was interesting listening to Prime Minister John Major give his remarks yesterday evening, and he was talking about how an attack on one democratic free countries, an attack on all democratic free countries, and in essence, it's a show of solidarity with the United States in this terrible hour.
It is, and that's been the response from many different countries, many of our allies. In fact, in London this morning, this is the picture that is probably on every newspaper in the United States and all over the world. But the headline on this is the day that changed the world. So many talk about war with the United States or something, but this one particularly says that this is something that is affecting not just the United States, but the entire world.
All right, Nathan Thomas, thank you so much for that report. And indeed, it is a day that looks like it will have changed the entire world. As yesterday's horrific events unfolded, it was difficult to keep track of exactly what was happening and where. ABC's John Donvan has pieced together this timeline.
We want to tell you what we know as we know it. We just got a report in that there's been some sort of explosion.
The first thing any television camera saw this morning was this. It was just before 9. Roughly 15 minutes earlier, an American Airlines jet hijacked from Boston had crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. There were 92 people on board.
I was sort of at my desk working, general office activity, and felt an enormous it almost felt like an earthquake. Like I could literally feel and see things in the office moving and the floor moving. Immediately after it was some sort of explosion or something, there was an enormous volume of debris and paper. It almost looked like a dirty parade. All of this material just falling down.
It does not appear that there's any kind of an effort up there yet. Now remember, oh my God.
Oh my God.
That looks like a second plane.
Minutes later, the second plane, the second tower. The fireball ate up the aircraft. It was a United Airlines jet from Boston, 65 people on board.
As soon as it got hit, I was thrown to a window. So I was very lucky to get out. There's a lot of people that didn't get out. There's a lot of people coming down the stairs, burnt up. It's bad.
A big explosion happened. Some guy came out. His skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
New York City was staggered, and still it wasn't over. Here in Washington, the Pentagon was now burning. Yet another hijacked aircraft, American Airlines Flight 77 with 64 on board, had crashed through the Pentagon's walls.
U.S. officials are saying there was no warning, no indicators of any kind of a likely terrorist attack. Number two, they say Pentagon officials within the intelligence and the counterterrorism offices are now looking at this very intensely.
Across Washington, ABC reporters were hearing officials use the word terrorism.
It seems obvious unofficially to people here that it was a terrorist attack, but they obviously can't reach any firm conclusions at this point. So the Pentagon is engaged, and I'm sure law enforcement is, but they say they had no warnings.
And around the nation's capital, a city full of potential targets, everyone was on edge.
Okay, there's been an explosion of some kind that shook the grounds of the Capitol. We all heard it. Everybody ran for cover. We don't know where it was. We don't see the smoke yet. Everybody's saying, get back. We're running, we're running, we're running, we're running. They're screaming at us to get back.
This was the president this morning.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
Mr. Bush was in Florida visiting a school. At the White House itself, everyone was evacuated. Then the whole federal government was evacuated, every federal worker. And in Washington, it was instant gridlock. In New York City, meanwhile, they were also evacuating. And suddenly, the towers began to collapse in on themselves.
Why are they pulling us out of here?
Because the tower's leaning.
The North Tower is
Broadway.
Right, Marty, quick. Oh my God, there it goes!
I looked up as soon as we got across the street. I looked up, I saw the tower start to buckle. I just turned and ran, ducked down, put a jacket over my head. 3 or 4 of us huddled together, and it was just black everywhere.
And with everyone asking the obvious question, how in the world, answers will be coming in fragments.
The American Airlines Flight 11, the 767 from Boston to Los Angeles, a flight attendant called the American Airlines Operations Center to let them know that 2 flight attendants had been stabbed and the perpetrators had broken into the flight deck.
Then, just before lunchtime, in a green field in Pennsylvania, one final crash. A United Airlines 757 carrying 45 people from Newark to San Francisco. Reportedly, a passenger on board used his cell phone to call 911 before the plane went down. The president's safety had become an issue.
We flew for a couple of hours on Air Force One at what appeared to be a very high altitude. We were not told where we would land until the time came. There were jet fighters accompanying the president's aircraft. He has been traveling, we are told by Ari Fleischer, and he will continue to travel.
Mr. Bush reached Washington earlier this evening. Already, we have these images that no one can ever forget. A tough guy mayor pained by what he saw.
The situation is that 2 airplanes have attacked apparently. Can't go to sleep. Why? They should not go to sleep. All right, well then let's go north then.
The dust, everywhere the dust, and how it just wouldn't come off. A desperate choice by desperate people who had no way out.
We thought was debris, and we realized it was people jumping. I can't do anymore.
Late this afternoon, another building weakened by the blast went down like a domino.
Finally, we clawed our way out over the rubble.
Yeah.
Come on down. You did all right. All right,
At this point, it's hard to believe that all of this happened in a morning. Military jets are crisscrossing the skies over Manhattan. National Guard units are out. Washington is shut down. Airports in the U.S. and Canada are closed. And the death toll is still uncountable and unimaginable. John Donvan, ABC News, Washington.
5 seconds.
Unimaginable indeed. Even as you look at those images, you cannot believe your eyes. As we've mentioned, the headquarters of the United States military was also targeted yesterday. John Donvan just talking about that. But Pentagon officials are vowing to carry on business as usual there today. ABC's Jim Sciutto is live outside the Pentagon. Jim, I understand they've pretty much suspended any search and rescue efforts, and they're just focusing on putting out that fire?
That's right, Elizabeth. It's a matter of safety. They want to put out the fire. They also want to make sure that the building is not in danger of collapsing around rescue workers. It was described by the Arlington police chief, who's participating in this operation, as peeling away the layers of the building so that they don't have to worry about them collapsing later. And that's their first priority before they do search and rescue. He also said that even recovering some of the victims, some of the dead bodies, could take days because they're treating this as a crime scene, and those victims are part of the evidence of that crime scene. So it's a sense of the time it's going to take, not just to put out this fire going on behind me, but also just to clear the scene. Really, it's going to take some time.
And in fact, there was initially an estimate of maybe 100 people killed. Then a few hours later, the Pentagon came out and said it could be as many as 800 people dead. Do we have any clearer figure now or any idea at all on what our casualty count might be?
The figure, Elizabeth, came from, again, the Arlington fire chief, and what he did is he gave a range of between 100 and 800. But when he spoke last, a couple of hours ago, he kind of backed off that 800 figure, just saying, listen, that's the high end, saying that the only thing they know for sure is that there were 67 people aboard the plane that crashed, and they know that they can almost assume that everyone on that plane died. Beyond that, it's just speculation at this point.
And even as they work to put out that fire and wait to search for more victims, work is going on inside the Pentagon. It is the nation's military headquarters, and this is a military incident. We are responding in a military way. We were talking earlier about the ships that have been dispatched. Do you have any more information on when the hospital ship, for example, might arrive, or the aircraft carriers that were going to be positioned off the shores of New York City, Washington, D.C., that sort of thing?
We asked the military, and they said for security reasons they are not going to say when those ships, the USS Comfort, a hospital ship, as you mentioned, out of Baltimore, as well as the USS George Washington, an aircraft carrier that's going to be used for medical purposes in New York, but they are not saying when they will arrive for security reasons.
All right, Jim Sciutto outside the Pentagon this morning. Thank you so much for that report. We'll be checking back in with you less than 2 hours after the hijacked jets plowed into the 2 World Trade Center towers. Both of them collapsed into pieces of rubble. ABC's Robert Krulwich has been reporting on the reasons behind the collapse of those buildings, that rapid, instantaneous destruction.
Why did the towers collapse as quickly and as suddenly as they did? Engineers from the original firm that built the towers told ABC they can only guess at this point, but they believe that the collisions themselves, the plane hitting building number 1 and the plane that smashed into building number 2, by themselves, they did not cause the collapse. It was the fire, they say, the intense fire and heat from the explosions that brought the buildings down. Temperatures inside could have built up to 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, steel loses its strength, and steel beams connect every floor to the outside walls. As it got hotter, the beams got weaker, and the hot air inside began to push and press against the outside walls until the outside walls just buckled, snapped, and released the top floor, which fell onto the floor below, and the entire building sinks in a straight vertical, the floors falling faster and faster down, until you notice that every floor in the building is gone. Viewed from another angle, you can see the same thing. Notice the aerial stays vertical, just stays straight as it sinks into the building. There's no buckling or tipping, just straight down. And this happened in both buildings. The first tower, too, stayed straight as it went down, each floor falling neatly on top of the other. So the reason the towers went so quickly is because all the floors were literally hanging onto the skin. And once the skin went, the buildings went too. Robert Krulwich, ABC News.
Indeed, the heat leading to the collapse of those 2 buildings, not the impact of those 2 commercial jetliners crashing into it. Derek, we were just talking about this. I'm joined by my colleague, Derek McGinty. You were wondering whether or not the terrorists knew that in fact, might be the structural reaction to this kind of devastation.
Exactly. Obviously, if you wanted to destroy buildings, this is just crashing the planes and was horrific enough, but the idea that the whole building would collapse afterwards would be something they want, but we just don't know whether or not, and it doesn't really even matter what they knew. Just the idea that they do such a thing is awful enough, and awful enough, in fact, to inspire these headlines that we're getting from around the country. This from the Tulsa World in Tulsa, Oklahoma, I think pretty much sums it all up. Attack on America. You really can't overstate it, and the size of this headline, of course, states it about as graphically as possible. This one from the Atlanta Constitution, outrage. You know, it just, thousands dead, a nation staggered. That's what it comes down to. And I think as you look to the public reaction to this, as we look around in various cities around the country, it gets to fear, sort of an all-consuming fear of what the next target could or would be if these 2 or these 3 attacks were not the end of things. Where would they strike next? In Detroit, for example, you saw that they closed a tunnel connecting downtown Detroit to Windsor, which is another part of the area. Many office buildings, the Renaissance Center, home to General Motors, evacuated. Again, people worried, what will the next target be? If you go around to Miami, parents took their kids out of schools, government offices were shut down, government meetings canceled. Again, people worried, where could the next target be? No one knew. In Dallas, frightened companies and government officials evacuated office buildings. The Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, as we know, was closed, along with just about every other airport in the country. People worried that their area, their town, their large office building, their government center could be the next victim.
Indeed, and as we showed some polling data a little bit earlier in the evening showing that so many Americans worried that, in fact, there would be another terrorist attack. Many Americans worried that they themselves would be the victims.
I think the key factor here is, as we've seen in so many newspapers and editorials, that we felt very secure, despite the fact that there had been attacks here before. Nobody ever expected anything like this. How could you imagine that this would happen? And when it did, people just said, oh, my goodness, you know, where will the next strike come, and how can I make myself safe? And, you know, the reaction is very understandable. But, again, as we sort this out over the next few days, it's going to have to be more of a tangible reaction, and we're going to be looking to our government leadership just for that.
Understandable. And the government leadership, thank you very much, Derek, is making great efforts at staying calm, at sending a message that the U.S. government is open, is operating, is fully in control, that the United States will not be changed in a dramatically terrible way as a result of this attack. Of course, life will change in certain aspects, certainly when it comes to flying. When those airports across the country do, in fact, reopen, it will be a very different experience for most Americans, possibly for the rest of our lives as we know it. However, it's important to note that as jittery as many Americans legitimately might be, the U.S. government, President Bush, leaders of Congress, getting together, united, saying it's very important that we send a message to whomever is behind this attack, that we will not be broken. U.S. stock markets will be closed today, but trading does continue overseas. As Derek reported earlier, Tokyo's Nikkei plunged 682 points, more than 6.5% today. But in London, the FTSE was sharply higher in early trading, following a big loss yesterday. That is good news. ABC's business editor, Betsy Stark, spoke with Peter Jennings about the possible financial fallout from the day of terrorism.
U.S. financial markets will be closed now for 48 hours. It's the first time since World War II that that's happened. And keep in mind that the New York Stock Exchange is just a few blocks from the World Trade Center Twin Towers. So in a sense, it's not surprising. It's going to be a while before rescue operations and cleanup operations make it possible for New York Stock Exchange employees to return to work.
The global economy and a greater number of stock exchanges in many more places makes 24-hour trading with or without the, well, to some degree, with or without the New York and the American stock exchanges today more possible, does it not?
Yes, it does, Peter. You know, one of the things I wanted to mention to you is there were economists talking today about the possibility that this might be the straw that breaks the camel's back, that this might be the event that tips the U.S. economy into recession. I mean, think about it. When markets don't trade, when planes don't fly, when businesses shut down, as we saw so many do today, when malls close, that's a drag on the U.S. economy. People aren't out there spending, and when you've got an economy that's growing at a snail's pace, those kinds of that kind of slowdown in the economy just for a period of days has the potential to push an economy teetering on recession over the brink.
ABC's Betsy Stark talking about the financial impact of this terrorist attack. This coming at the same time that as we said a moment ago, the President and Congress taking great pains to say we are at work, we are in our offices, we are not shut down by any stretch of the imagination. ABC's Josh Gerstein is live near the White House. Josh, soon, I would assume within the hour or two, people showing up for work in Washington, D.C. What is Washington, D.C., the capital, waking up to this morning?
Well, the White House behind me is still dark at this hour. President Bush is an early riser, so we expect him to be up shortly if he's not up already. And he usually gets his first national security briefing as early as 7 o'clock in the morning. We'll expect that to happen, probably a full national security meeting. And there's talk of a meeting with the congressional leadership as well. But this city is beginning to come to life, just beginning because it's still early. City buses are out rolling this morning. We've seen delivery trucks out on the street. There's a little more traffic than there was overnight. It's notable only because yesterday the prime feature here of the traffic pattern was a reverse commute at about 10 o'clock in the morning. Pretty much everybody working in downtown Washington was headed on the roads out of the city. They're going to try to do things in a bit more routine fashion this morning. Elizabeth?
So suffice it to say then that D.C. is not in the same state that New York City is in which case Mayor Giuliani has said to all New Yorkers, if you don't have a really critical, crucial job, please don't go to work, stay home.
No, they're going to try to get back to normal as much as that is possible today. However, we do have a very, very serious situation here in the Washington area just across the Potomac River at the Pentagon, where, as we've just heard within the last few minutes, they're continuing the search and rescue efforts, the firefighting efforts, and so forth. But Washington, D.C., although there were reports of incidents at the Capitol and the State Department during the day yesterday, those proved to be untrue, thankfully. The city so far has emerged largely unscathed from this. And I'm sure city officials and President Bush and the rest of the national security apparatus hopes that continues to be the case. Elizabeth?
All right. Josh Gerstein, thank you so much for that report from our nation's capital. We're going to go now back down to Ground Zero here in New York City after getting that report on the status of things in Washington, D.C. Obviously, it is a horrific scene in Lower Manhattan. The streets there, down near beneath 14th Street, you can see there eerie, shrouded still in the ever-present smoke and dust that has been hanging over this entire city since yesterday morning. You can see the remnants of steel girders of buildings. The rescue crews have been working throughout the night in backbreaking, difficult, and often dangerous work, going through that rubble and that wreckage, gingerly trying to peel back the pieces of boulders, that sort of thing, of walls of buildings that have come down to see if there's anybody that they can rescue underneath. You can see there they've amassed a huge number of fire trucks, backhoes, all sorts of equipment that they need to help, frankly, get this wreckage out of there, find out who's beneath the rubble, get some handle on what the death count is, what the injury count is, and perhaps find evidence somewhere on who might be behind this devastating terrorist attack. Where are we going now? We're going to go for more reaction from a stunned nation. We have a report from ABC's Aaron Hayes.
Suicide bombers, read all about it.
There is, rippling across this country,
Suicide bombers, suicide bombers.
Great fear tonight. This attack was on every American.
I can't believe it. And it's so sad that it's come to this.
The first thing I thought of this morning when I saw that was Hiroshima, Pearl Harbor, all over again. The horror of it. And thinking that we're headed for World War III.
I want to go home to my family right now. That's what I want to do, get close to my kids.
We were seeing things we have never seen before, not just on our TV sets, but signs all around that this is as serious as it gets. At the airports is where it was most obvious, the national confusion.
I'm really scared. I feel helpless.
Paralysis.
All the lines on the cell phones are all busy.
Planes making their way to the first airport in sight. Unloaded passengers stunned to find themselves in places they had no plans to be, unsure what to do.
I'm totally shook up right now because we were in the air when it happened. We're not told anything about it.
They said good luck, sleep in the airport.
And in city after city, anxious officials evacuated one building after another.
Our boss just finally came and told us, just go ahead and leave.
Not because of actual threats, but because no one knew what might be next.
There is a war here now.
We are a nation now on high alert, not just militarily, but psychologically, shaken on every level.
Just waiting.
For what?
To see if anything else is going to happen. To see if we're going to be attacked here in Atlanta.
It's a very strange feeling to be so threatened.
The uncertainty set in motion a wave of shutting down across the nation. Not just the obvious government buildings, but malls in Georgia and theme parks in Florida.
Due to unforeseen circumstances, the Magic Kingdom is now closing.
And schools everywhere.
Our military at home and around the world.
And in those classrooms still in session, you could hear the anxiety of the youngest generations, for whom this kind of attack had been limited to their history lessons until today.
They hit the Pentagon. It's a slap in the face. It's the nerve center of our military, and they hit the Pentagon? What is that?
I always thought America was like my superhero, like nothing could harm America. I mean, America is everyone's defender.
This is an attack on our generation. It is. It is an attack on our culture, our system, our values, what we do.
There is a growing sense tonight that what we do now will truly define us as a nation.
I'd hate to see panic, because then whoever did this will win, and we can't let them win.
We are Americans, and I'm glad I am an American. We need, we just need to come together, and I think we will.
It will take that and much more in the coming days to see the nation, the entire nation, through this.
Head that way.
Aaron Hayes, ABC News, Atlanta.
The far-reaching effects of what happened when these terrorists unleashed this series of attacks yesterday morning. 4 commercial airline jets hijacked, 2 of them crashing into the twin towers of the World Trade Center here in New York City. Those towers, each of them hit, each of them collapsing a short time later. A third jet crashing into the Pentagon, a fourth jet hijacked, crashing into a field conceivably on its way to Camp David, we are told. Throughout the night, to sum up the last 3 hours, rescue crews struggling mightily in lower Manhattan to get through the rubble, to extinguish the last of those fires, to begin the grim and gruesome task of finding, hopefully, survivors, certainly many, many victims. And in the Pentagon, where the fire is still burning, crews not even able to begin searching and rescuing for victims, because at this point they must extinguish all those fires. We are going to wrap up our coverage here at these ABC News studios and pass it on to my colleagues Diane Sawyer and Charles Gibson at the Good Morning America studios. For all of us here at the Uptown studio, I'm Elizabeth Vargas. Charlie and Diane will pick up coverage in just a moment.
And we say good morning to you. I'm Charles Gibson.
I'm Diane Sawyer, and it is another very different morning in America.
Yeah, this is not just another morning. The scenes from New York today are really like a war zone. The adjectives that you can pick, one fireman that